people from? Who are all these people from?
So can you please tell me? I'm not going to... please wait.
You know, I've covered a lot of companies. I've covered a lot of Machiavellian companies where, you know, people play rough. I don't think I've ever seen anything on the scale of Nissan.
He is making you, but you act from this side. I mean, it's corrupt.
One of the most dramatic elements was Ravinder Passi's home being raided by court officials in Yokohama.
You scared my wife. You scared my children. I worked in this for 16 years.
So Rav Passi's journey into the darkest recesses of the Japanese corporate world started when he was the general counsel, the highest corporate lawyer position in the company.
In the past few minutes, Nissan has revealed that its chairman has been arrested after allegations of serious misconduct.
He was tasked with investigating Carlos Ghosn. And he was told, conduct an internal investigation and get to the heart of the matter. And then along the way, he started to notice serious conflicts of interest.
He is one of the few people who knows an extreme amount of detail regarding the alleged crimes by Carlos Ghosn. And he's now ready to tell his own story on the record about some of the events that happened.
My name is Ravinder Passi. I'm the former Global General Counsel of Nissan Motor Co. Limited. And you could say, yes, I had a front row seat in terms of what was going on.
When Carlos Ghosn saved Nissan years ago, he was depicted in Japanese comic books as this hero, and now maybe we'll see comic books where he's the villain.
In corporate Japan, Nissan was quite an unusual company. It was led for 2 decades by a non-Japanese executive.
Well, Carlos Ghosn was a hero in the Japanese business world. If you had a global business celebrity in Japan and worldwide, it was definitely Carlos Ghosn.
In a country with few foreigners at the top, he stood out. But over the years, he saved Nissan from bankruptcy, allied with Renault and Mitsubishi, and turned the alliance into one of the most competitive in the world.
Yet as the years went on, you know, I think his ambitions changed a little bit. He started thinking about legacy plays, and one of them was to really tighten the alliance between Renault and Japan. And unbeknownst to him, there was a contingent of senior Nissan executives that were really felt threatened by that move. They really thought that they would lose complete control of the car company, and even in the government, there was probably a little bit of anxiety about a national champion in the auto industry falling under full-blown foreign control.
Carlos Ghosn was an auto industry leader, respected by many in Japan. Now he's in jail.
The arrest of Carlos Ghosn came completely out of the blue. This was in November of 2018. He was coming to Japan on Nissan's corporate jet for a regular executive meeting, and he was met on the tarmac by Japanese authorities who whisked him away to a jail and charged him with financial misconduct crimes.
So what happened was that a power struggle ensued inside the company, and somewhere along the way it was criminalized. By that I mean that there were allegations leveled at Carlos Ghosn about the way he reported his pay to Japanese authorities, the way he handled money inside the company, that in other contexts might have been a board action, might have been handled internally. A number of executives at Nissan decided to take this difference and take it over to the Tokyo prosecutor's office, and that unleashed a chain of events that would shake the entire auto industry.
So after Carlos Ghosn was arrested, Nissan launched an internal investigation into the events that led up to his arrest.
So Rav Passi was tasked with investigating Carlos Ghosn, and he was told, get to the heart of the matter, find out what Carlos Ghosn did wrong and bring it to our shareholders.
It's really complicated because you had various things coming out of the weeds. 2018, the investigation has started, and we become aware of matters in terms of conflicts, actions by certain individuals that cause some concern because things might not quite be what they seem.
So in our story, we really took a close look at Harinada and his role in Carlos Ghosn's downfall.
Harinada is one of the most fascinating figures inside Nissan. He's also a lawyer. He's originally Malaysian. Hello, Mr. Hadi. And he had a meteoric rise through the company and became very, very close to Carlos Ghosn and other top figures. He had a front row seat at all the major strategic deliberations at the company. And when he discovered that Carlos Ghosn, as his final legacy play, was going to tighten the relationship between Renault and Nissan, he made a decision to go against Carlos Ghosn. And he became one of the key figures that decided that Carlos Ghosn had to go.
Harinada was somebody who actually recruited me into the company, so I have a long-standing relationship with him, or did have a long-standing relationship with him. For many, many years, he was a mentor. I had doubts about the credibility of the process right at the start. Harinada had a plea deal with the Tokyo prosecutors. Now, that suggests he was intrinsically involved in some of the wrongdoing, or the allegations of wrongdoing, and it just didn't smell right, just doesn't sit right.
So there was a basic conflict of interest. In other words, Harinada had to deliver results to Japanese prosecutors to avoid his own criminal liability, and he's accusing and leading the investigation of Carlos Ghosn.
Some of the people who had been involved in the original alleged crimes were also looking into the affairs themselves. Ravinder Passi began pointing out some of these conflict of interest issues. And the reason for that is essentially his concern was for the company. If the company's own investigation into itself was compromised, that could lead to a very weak position in various lawsuits that it was dealing with across the world.
I had discussions with Harry, discussions with the statutory auditors about these conflicts, discussions with HR about some of these conflicts, because at that point, we reported into him. You know, at the time, everything was quite, as you can imagine, it was, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, we've got to move fast. But when you step back and look at some of these things, you just think, my God, what was going on here? Because me, members of my team, were being placed in immediate danger. Your chairman's been arrested, a representative director's been arrested. They both happen to be foreigners. And then now what we need to do, we're being instructed to do, is certain compliance professionals need to go into properties in Brazil, for example, and retrieve evidence. They've got to do it very carefully, because if they don't do it carefully, they're going to get convicted of criminal activities. And likewise, when a team of lawyers were commissioned to go to Lebanon, I mean, one of my immediate concerns was, why are lawyers from Nissan being sent to go to Lebanon to retrieve evidence? These are just lawyers, they're corporate lawyers from Nissan. You had revelations that a number of executives had benefited from share appreciation rights when they shouldn't have. I mean, you know, substantive amounts of money being taken by these guys when they weren't entitled to take them. And you do think, yes, how is this going to look later on? It's going to look quite concerning. So that triggered for me the sort of assessment that, well, I'm going to have to do something, because up until this point, I haven't put down on paper these conflicts and these issues.
So Rav Pasi makes a fateful move. He writes this letter to the board listing every suspicion he has in great detail, backed up by evidence, backed up by memos, of why this internal investigation had serious problems. He sends the letter to the board, and it's crickets. He doesn't hear much of anything.
Nothing happened thereafter. Nothing at all. Just like it just gone into a black box.
And he began to suspect that there was a desire, even at the highest level within Nissan, to kind of sweep these conflicts of interest under the rug.
Unfortunately for me, I think, again, with hindsight, people must have thought that this is the nail that's sticking out, and we can't have this. Within 3 days of me submitting that to the board of directors, that letter to the independent board of directors, I was removed from the Goan Executive Conduct Matters. I was then told that I could not attend board meetings anymore. And up until that point, I had attended every single board meeting. I was then also told that after 8 years of being in Japan, I'd be going back to the UK. It eventually transpired that I'd be the VP of Projects and Transformation, managing a team of 3. So you can imagine what this feels like at this stage. Almost an arbitrary removal from Japan, where I've lived for 8 years, had 3 children there, my family has grown up, and we've been settled there, having a few months earlier been promoted to vice president at a global level, to being almost demoted.
So Pasi was essentially being reassigned to get him as far away from the internal investigation as possible, and also to a certain extent in retaliation to some of the issues that he brought up regarding the internal investigation and Harinada.
What happened to Rav Pasi can be seen as a series of corporate humiliations. I mean, first of all, his immediate responsibilities were taken away from him. Eventually, he lost, the coveted general counsel title. But it didn't stop there. Toward the end of his stay in Japan, Rav and his wife were convinced that they were being followed.
During that period, I'd noticed that whilst driving my car, I'd have other cars following me. First time I noticed this was around mid-March, and I was driving, I can't remember where I was going, but this grey van, small van, just literally started following me. And I noticed that there was somebody in the car taking pictures. And lo and behold, we were absolutely being followed either by people on foot or other individuals, 2 or 3, normally 2 burly men in a car, different cars at different times, following us around. They were following the family as well. And, given I'd seen the Nissan security department behave in a very, very egregious manner with others in terms of following and surveilling, I was very concerned as to what they were doing and who they were giving this information to. Because if they're giving this information to the authorities, you do think, why? What's going on here? I mean, this is just not normal behavior.
And this all culminated in a rather dramatic event in the middle of 2020.
Who are you people?
Where Nissan had hired a legal team and had obtained an unusual court order from the district court in Yokohama
to basically do a search of his home and seizure of his corporate laptop and phone and other documents.
If you don't let us in now, we have to break this key.
So it's a pretty extreme way to treat someone who'd spent 16 years at the company.
These people have all come in. We don't really know who they are, apart from the fact that I've been shown a badge that says the Yokohama court. And they're here to recover a laptop and a mobile phone. It was even more weird because I'd highlighted to the directors that certain Nissan executives were trying to recover this laptop and this phone whilst I was still in Japan. And I was very concerned because it had evidence on there that related to misconduct matters and other forms of inappropriate conduct. It was just another form of intimidation, another form of harassment, forcing me almost to leave the company and the country. Because once they'd retained and obtained these items, we were still followed, which, again, I just couldn't understand. What is the point of doing that? This is a car company. This is not the KGB.
I think it's fair to say that Rav Pasi didn't have full battlefield awareness of all the intrigue going on at Nissan. I mean, Harinata is interesting because he's both charismatic and charming, and one of the most brutal corporate infighters one could ever run across.
This is a confidential company email, right? You should not have this.
If he had fallen into line, he would probably still have his job at Nissan, be paid very well, and continued his work.
A career that he spent 16 years building at Nissan is irretrievably broken. It's been smashed to smithereens. He and his family paid a huge price, certainly. But in terms of being able to sleep at night, I think he's come out ahead.
I highlighted issues to the highest levels of the company so that they could be dealt with appropriately by those in charge. There was no response to those, and there was retaliation against me. What's really profound, like absolutely profound, is that none of your colleagues, I mean people who you have known for years, forget it.
Yeah.
You're on your own.
Yeah.
And you got to be ready for that. You've got to be ready for that. If you take it on anyway.
This is the awful truth. There's always someone in the family that's pushing it.
This lady does not deserve to be taken advantage of, especially at your age with your own grandchild.
Yeah.
My grandma is having to sue them. I'm testifying against them. Nobody's talking. They're one floor below right now. I get afraid to go on the elevator. It's sad that it had to devolve to this.
It's like a soap opera to me.
It's a very sad thing.
It's a family feud. A family feud.
Here's a family that, on paper, you would think has the wealth that so many people seek, yet at the end of the day, it seemed to sort of rip everybody apart. My name's Tom Schoenberg. I'm a senior reporter here at Bloomberg News, cover financial enforcement. I was approached by someone close to the Schottenstein family and asked whether or not I would be interested in writing about Beverly Schottenstein and this case that she had against J.P. Morgan. And it was immediately clear that there was a great story here to be told. So I started just, assembling all sorts of documents that the family made available to me. That included a diary that Beverly had begun writing when she started having suspicions about what was actually going on with her money. Beverly obtained her wealth from the Schottenstein kind of retail empire that has at times included Big Lots, Value City, American Eagle Outfitters, DSW Shoes. Beverly's husband died, and at which point they sold off their portion of the company, bringing them an enormous amount of wealth at around 1990. Estimates of her wealth were around $90 million. She, for many years, had that pool of money being managed by outside advisors. Her grandsons in the late 2000s had both graduated and were becoming financial advisors. She gave them a little bit to work with, and over time, her grandson, Evan, became the trustee of her entire estate. Managing sort of family money is not a conflict. In fact, some ways in wealth management, it's kind of how you get your start. It's kind of the seed that you need to sort of get going in the business. But Beverly started having suspicions that something was wrong probably in around 2016.
Well, there were suspicious things, but taken separately without everyone talking about their own experiences, it was hard to really put it together.
She had written a check to her caretaker, Dawn, that bounced. So she went down to her local Chase branch to sort of find out what was going on. She wasn't getting paper statements in the mail, so she asked them to print out a number of her statements having to do with her checking account and her credit card account.
So we went to the bank and asked for the statements. And she got a whole year and going through all of them, page by page by page.
And it was there she saw all sorts of charges that she said she didn't authorize or didn't know about.
I was becoming very, very suspicious. I was starting to look in the money part, and that's what bothered me more when I saw that money was going, and I was not a big spender.
Around the same time, Dawn, she starts noticing Beverly's son, who lived in the condominium below her, came up with Evan with a shredder and started grabbing papers in her office area, including some with J.P. Morgan letterhead, and just started sitting at the kitchen table, just shredding documents over and over.
Yeah, they came in one morning.
They used to do it in the back.
Through the back door, and they brought the shredder inside. And then they went in the drawers in the office and took out all the papers, and they started doing it. I was very suspicious because I know you don't go around and destroying papers.
Beverly said that they had done this many times before.
That's when she said to me, Dawn, I'm going to write my feelings in this black book.
Diary.
And it's a diary, and she started writing. Each day, she would write a little at a time.
Around the holidays of 2018, a package had arrived, a FedEx package, and in it were materials about a venture capital fund based out of the Cayman Islands. Dawn and some other family members take a look at this, and they see that Beverly is signed up for this fund to the tune of $5 million over the course of several years.
And that was really the beginning of it. That was sort of the tip of the iceberg when it became obvious that something was going on, that my grandmother really wasn't aware of this fund.
You know, Beverly started to panic. She got really upset and called, JP Morgan's headquarters in New York and asked for Jamie Dimon. She said she was told someone would call her back, but she says that never happened. She wrote a letter to Evan and Avi, and in there she laid out a number of things that were concerning her: unauthorized trading, the checking account. She had about $1 million worth of jewelry in a safe deposit box, and that her son Bobby had the key to that box, and that jewelry had gone missing. All this was kind of packaged in this, 5-page handwritten amendment to a will and trust.
There's such an evolving narrative about why the jewelry was taken. The only truth we really know is that the jewelry is gone. But why it happened, there have been a lot of different stories.
You just don't take your mother's wonderful things and hand it out.
And they emailed that note to J.P. Morgan to seize all activity on her account.
And it ended up setting off a firestorm after that. As soon as they got this email that there was a cease and desist and that she wanted to send her money and change brokerage firms, they were actually vacationing one floor below downstairs. They're there right now.
The next day, Beverly's in her place. The granddaughter's still in her place visiting. Dawn is there, and up comes Bobby kind of barging through the door. And he's screaming about what was sent to the JP Morgan. They're now investigating now. And he's furious, takes his mother and sort of puts her into a chair, gets pen and paper, and she says physically forced her to write a retraction letter.
They were pushing me around.
It was a scary time. I was really afraid too.
I had to take her to the doctor, and she did an x-ray because she was in so much pain.
The locks had to be changed. The phone number had to be changed. I really thought we were going to have to hire guards to be outside just for protection.
Oh, it was terrible.
Horrible scene.
Beverly brought her case before the Financial Industry Regulatory Authorities, usually known as FINRA. It took several months of hearings. She sees all sorts of transactions that's going on, hundreds of them that she claims that she never knew about, never authorized, but yet were logged in JP Morgan's files as having been direct requests from her. That included the sale of a large amount of Apple stock worth several $1 million, as well as all her stock in Big Lots. Over the course of their time with JP Morgan, Evan and Avi were making all sorts of trading on her account that was generating millions of dollars in commissions for themselves and the bank, yet she was not sort of getting any of the type of gains that you would expect sort of an $80 million account in a bullish market to be able to get. They issued a ruling entirely in her favor, finding that her grandsons, as well as JP Morgan, they were liable for violating their fiduciary duty, misrepresenting themselves, and they also found that the bank and her grandson, Evan, were liable for elder abuse. Evan and Avi, they were fired from JP Morgan. They issued an award of about $19 million. I reached out for comment, and JP Morgan emphasized that Evan and Avi were no longer with the firm and that their actions do not represent the sort of values of the bank. I reached out to Evan and Avi, heard back from their lawyer saying that, they disagree with the law and the facts that FINRA kind of used to decide the case against them and are seeing if they can have it withdrawn. Her son, Bobby, wrote her a letter, said his sons weren't criminals, and he also admits to taking her jewelry. And he says he needed it to pay off some bad business debts he had.
They never once came up to say, I'm sorry.
If there had been an apology and some acceptance, and asking for forgiveness from my grandmother, I don't think we'd be in the position that we are now.
Since the piece came out, we've received dozens of messages from people, many of whom are telling their own sort of personal tales of, kind of financial advisors gone bad, or family members who got control of an estate and abused, those within. It seems that it's really resonated with a lot of people. I keep, hearing a lot of feedback about Beverly and how, a lot of people feel she did the right thing.
You're never too old to stand up for yourself and try to right an injustice. She was adamant that she wanted to stand up for herself, but at the end of the day, they did wrong.
It's a painful life lesson. Beverly taught them that you don't mess with grandma.
On April 20th, oil markets did something they never had before, and they crashed, went into negative territory, and closed the day at minus $40. Meanwhile, in a place called Thaden Boyce in Essex, a group of 9 traders, led by a guy called Cuddles, made $660 million over the course of a couple of hours.
The price of oil has collapsed to a record low.
We've never really seen anything like it. WTI this morning down more than 35%.
People maybe wouldn't have been so surprised if the oil price had fallen to zero, but the oil price went to minus 38. It went far lower than anyone had expected. And so lots of people in the market were saying, well, hang on, something else is going on here.
A couple of months later, I started to get wind through a kind of network of sources that a tiny firm in the outskirts of London had made a huge amount of money that day and potentially had some part to play in what happened.
The information we got was that 9 traders at Vega Capital London had made in the region of $660 million in one day. As a group, I think they made as much money in one day as Apple makes from its international sales in one day. I mean, it's an insane sum of money.
Did they pull off a fantastic trade? Did they predict the way the market was moving and get it absolutely right? Or was there something else going on, and had they actually done something that breached market rules in a bid to sort of push the market? And that investigation is ongoing. So Paul Commins is a trader who cut his teeth in the pits in the 80s and 90s when everyone had a nickname. His was Cuddles. If you can imagine, that was a very sort of cutthroat type of world where people are doing, hundreds of thousands and millions of dollar trades by shouting at each other, giving hand signals, and then sort of scrawling on scraps of paper.
The culture of the trading pits in London was very influenced by the working class guys who became traders there. They weren't like the city bankers that had gone before them. They weren't usually Oxford or Cambridge. They didn't wear Savile Row suits. They were ordinary working guys who happened to have a talent for trading. And a lot of them came from Essex.
I think there was 400 traders in the pits, and Cuddles in his oil and gas pit was described to us as amongst the top 3. In amongst that, was very successful and made very large amounts of money as a young man. But inevitably, mechanization and the arrival of electronic markets was the kind of death knell for the pits. And in 2005, the IPE closed down.
And when the pits shut down, a lot of the traders who worked there lost their jobs or quit or went to work for financial institutions. But Paul Commins decided to start his own trading collective out in Essex.
Some of them are ex-pit guys, cut from the same cloth as him. Lots of them are actually sort of in their 20s, and they're his, drinking buddy's son, or they're his own kids' friends from football. They're young lads, hungry and ambitious, and he brings them into the fold. And fairly shortly, he's got, maybe a dozen or so traders that they're independent, let's be clear, but they're all part of this collective.
Yeah, I'll let Liam deal with Essex.
I am from Essex, so I feel like I'm free to, to get into this.
Sweet, as they say.
If you were to ask someone in Britain how they would imagine a kind of Essex person, they would see someone who's maybe slightly flamboyant, with a sort of Cockney accent, a sort of Guy Ritchie-style accent. Not afraid to splash the cash, but it's probably pretty bright and has done well for themselves.
Don't even make sense, does it?
But, these guys, they drove around very nice Rolls Royces and Bentleys. They went to places like Marbella on holiday.
Faden Boyce is a very wealthy place. You have to have considerable income to be able to afford to live in that village. It's a really nice place to live, and it's 20 minutes tube ride away from the city.
Earlier in the summer, we have this lead, which is that there's this tiny firm called Vega Capital London, and they were the biggest winners from the biggest oil crash in history. Anyone that covers markets is going to be surprised about that. You're thinking your BPs of the world or your Glencores, but it's this tiny firm.
And one of the big challenges that we had was actually finding out who worked with Vega Capital. It wasn't immediately obvious, and at first we had absolutely no idea. If you go to the Vega Capital website, it says it's under construction. If you do basic online searching, it's very difficult to find anyone who's publicly connected to the company.
So inevitably, we're incredibly curious at this point. Like, who the hell are these people?
The more reporting we did, the more it became clear that this group were connected socially as well as professionally. They went to weddings together, they played golf together, they would go on holiday together. We found out that a number of them were members of the West Ham Supporters Club in London. A few of them started companies together, so you could see all the connections between them and start to see a distinct group emerging.
And it really just was this kind of shock that, this wasn't just like a hedge fund or a firm you'd never heard of. This was actually a group of buddies who all had the same experience on this day and had all made a huge amount of money. So if you're an oil trader, there's a number of different ways you can trade, and probably the most popular is WTI futures contracts.
And it's basically a contract that says, I'm going to buy 1,000 barrels of oil from you at this point in the future, or I'm going to sell 1,000 barrels of oil to you at this point in the future.
It's actually just a financial contract to gamble on to predict whether oil is going to go up or down.
On the 20th of April in Essex, there had been signals for a while that this was going to be an exceptional day in oil markets. And we know that some of them arose early and started their trading in the early hours of the morning while it was still dark outside.
Essentially what they were doing is buying contracts that gave them an obligation to buy oil at whatever the price ended up at 2:30 p.m. So they're basically placing a bet that oil is going to fall throughout the day.
But they're simultaneously selling lots of oil as well. And whether they make a profit and how much profit they make is the difference between what they buy the oil for and what they sell the oil for. Now, of course, we now know throughout April 20th, the price dropped and dropped.
So this is going very well for them. They are committed to selling oil at these prices, and the prices are continuing to fall, which means they're going to be able to offset it and buy oil at cheaper at the end of the day. Now, once it gets to kind of 1:30, 2 p.m., that's when things start to get really interesting. Suddenly there's a kind of influx of buyers and sellers, as desperation increases in the market and trading volumes go up. Now at 2:08 p.m. exactly, something bizarre and unprecedented happened, which is that oil passes into negative territory.
And it fell to a record level of minus $38.
We've never seen anything like it, period, in terms of the contraction of the global economy.
That huge gulf between what they were buying the oil for and what they were selling it for enabled them to make more money than they ever thought possible.
So their profit was the difference between minus 37, and all of these positive numbers on every contract they sold.
The price of crude briefly hit minus $37 a barrel. For one group of traders operating from a small office, it was a very, very profitable day.
It's important to remember this had never happened before in the history of oil trading. No one could have predicted it.
I can't think of another example of where you enter a trade and you get paid on both sides. You get paid both to sell and to buy. It's unthinkable.
One thing we know about the Cuddles Trading Arcade is that they were very comfortable taking large risks. And, you have to be clear, this was a large risk.
Yeah, we spoke to oil traders, both people that know these guys and people that don't, and they all say that this is, incredibly risky.
And that's actually what stops a lot of oil traders doing trading like this. They simply aren't willing to stomach the risk. But Cuddles and his friends were.
So when the kind of final calculations came down, the group of the 9 most profitable traders made $660 million or thereabouts between them. I mean, if you can imagine, I think 3 or 4 of them made in excess of 100 million each.
One of the astonishing things about this trade is that 2 of the individuals who made more than $100 million in a single day were in their 20s. One of them was 22 years old. Only a few years earlier, he'd been posting on his social media about doing teenage stuff with his mates in town and going to see girls and rap music. And here he is a few years later making $100 million in a single day's trading. When me and Liam discovered that, we couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. Oil trading is a zero-sum game. Anytime you're making money as an oil trader, someone else is losing it.
Amongst the biggest losers were the investors in this Chinese fund, Crude Oil Treasure Fund. There were thousands of them, and they lost everything.
Lots of people had put their savings into oil funds. They lost money that day. Big banks and brokers who sort of stand in the middle of trading parties, they lost money that day.
And another interesting thing is that oil-producing countries like Kuwait or Canada, they sell oil as an average of the WTI closing price over the preceding month. So the fact that one of those numbers in that average was minus 37 meant, if you can imagine, countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait potentially lost a couple of dollars on every single barrel of oil they sold that month.
Vega Capital's traders made such an extraordinary sum of money that it was inevitable there would be some scrutiny of what they did. But it wasn't just the sums of money they made. In the vital half an hour before the settlement price was set, they were by far the biggest sellers of oil futures in the market, which is an incredible thing to think about when you consider that the other participants in that oil market are going to be the world's biggest banks, oil majors, BP and Shell, and here you have a group of 9 guys in Essex who are having this significant influence over a global market for oil.
I mean, I think you have to assume that if these guys had made $7 million or $10 million, they probably would be celebrating in Essex right now. But the fact that they made closer to $700 million has meant that they are facing understandable scrutiny.
We wrote individually to all the Vega traders who did exceptionally well that day, and we got a letter in response from a law firm representing the group. The law firm was at pains to point out, number one, that they haven't been accused of any wrongdoing, that they all traded independently and separately, and they'd basically all made up their own minds that this was what was going to happen in oil markets based on publicly available knowledge, and decided to execute this trade.
What I love about these stories is there's a real variance of opinion, and some people will look at what happened and think that must be dodgy. They all traded at the end of the day. They all made a huge amount of money while all these people lost. That's shocking. But lots of people say these guys are at acute disadvantage. They're in a market that's inhabited by, huge technology-driven funds and firms and oil giants that have got all the advantages in the world, and when you get a bunch of Essex geezers who essentially beat the market and find a way to make a huge amount of money, they should get a pat on the back, really, because that's the dream. Since this happened, a lot of the guys have stopped trading the monthly settlements that they'd done so well at in the past. Several of them have set up new companies. They've essentially gone very quiet. Any kind of social media presence they had has kind of closed down. By all accounts, they're, waiting this out.
It's certainly too early to try and predict how the regulatory investigations are going to pan out. We just don't know. There's a number of potential outcomes for these guys. Potential punishments if there are any findings of manipulation against Vega or anyone affiliated with it might be you could be fined, you could be banned from trading, and in the most extreme cases there have even been criminal prosecutions in the past of people who have been found to have been manipulating the settlement and misconduct related to trade at settlement. There are other outcomes too. One obvious one is going to be they're able to walk away from this life-changing trade with all the money that they made and celebrated as heroes in the trading community. That they'll go down as legends.
It's very important, given the nature of the climate crisis right now, for the general public to have an understanding of what progress is or is not actually happening. And I think many readers right now, they'll see these hundreds and hundreds of companies making these big, bold climate claims. And they would be forgiven to think that we're well on our way to meeting the emission reduction trajectory we need to be on. And the reality of the matter is we're just not on that trajectory. And a key reason for this sort of disconnect is the use of offsets that aren't doing what they claim to be doing.
We have a massive potential for sort of willful blindness. We can convince ourselves of things regardless of what the facts are. And so that's what tends to happen in these cases. It's not that anybody is setting out to commit climate fraud. They sort of walk themselves into a situation and they convince themselves of one thing, and that allows them to convince themselves of another thing. But at the end of the day, they're doing something that makes no sense at all.
My name is Ben Elgin. I wrote the story about how the billion-dollar market for carbon offsets is setting back the fight against climate change. So one of the challenges in reporting on carbon offsets and trying to figure out what's going on is really finding good experts who have been steeped in this marketplace and are willing to candidly talk about it. One of the best people for this is a fellow named Mark Trexler, and I've been talking to him for more than a decade.
My name is Mark Trexler. I've worked in climate change for the last 30 years. I was actually hired by the World Resources Institute in Washington to work on the first carbon offset project in 1988. In terms of defining a carbon offset, one of the beauties, so to speak, of greenhouse gases, sort of the silver lining of greenhouse gases, when you put up a molecule of CO2 into the atmosphere, it can be anywhere in the planet in 7 days. And therefore, if there's an option to reduce emissions on the other side of the planet, and you can do that very cheaply as compared to doing it in your factory, for example, then why not pay that person, that factory on the other side of the planet to reduce their emissions? Then you are, in a sense, offsetting your emissions, and the atmosphere doesn't really see your emissions anymore.
So carbon offsets have been around for quite some time, and they were actually key with these international climate agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol, which mandated the wealthiest countries reduce their greenhouse gas emissions.
The treaty was signed on the 11th of December, 1997.
Decided. The business community in general saw carbon offsets as a huge opportunity to comply with whatever policies and measures might be coming down the pike on climate change much more cost effectively.
We've seen a huge surge in companies making big proclamations about how they're going carbon neutral or zeroing out all of their carbon emissions.
We're going to reduce our carbon footprint to net zero.
Unilever is committing to net zero emissions.
We can achieve a net zero emissions world.
We began looking at these corporate claims of dramatically reduced emissions, and we noticed so many of these companies were using carbon offsets to achieve these aims. And as we began to look at the carbon offset projects themselves, what we found is that the environmental benefits claimed by these companies are not actually what they seem to be. And as we sort of saw and spotted a number of these very aggressive carbon offset projects, which appeared to be generating inflated credits or bogus credits, we saw a number of them were associated with the Nature Conservancy. This surprised us. The Nature Conservancy is the world's biggest environmental group. They have about $1 billion a year in revenues, and they've been around for 7 decades. They've preserved about 125 million acres of land, and they've done so many good works over the years, and they've been very strong in terms of working with corporate partners. The Nature Conservancy has taken a different approach, a very pragmatic and pro-business approach. They will not go out and criticize a big polluter, but they're very happy to work with them. Some might say that, well, that's selling out, but others would say, and those at the Nature Conservancy would say, these companies have deep pockets. They can help fund important preservation work, and we have absolutely no problem working with them on this stuff. So companies are very warm, and they've partnered with the Nature Conservancy for many years. And yeah, it definitely lends a sheen of credibility to these projects.
Here's 20 new reasons to visit Disney World this year.
If you look at, for instance, Disney, that's a sprawling company with theme parks and cruise lines that burn up diesel fuel. They have office buildings and television studios that consume electricity. So these companies are trying to make major reductions in their carbon footprints, but it's very difficult to change these fundamental ways their businesses operate. So Disney has been a big buyer of carbon offsets that are orchestrated by the Nature Conservancy. One of the projects that they buy from is called Pennsylvania Ridges. And that's a plot of land. Most of the land is actually about a 3-hour drive outside of Philadelphia. Interestingly, this land, 3,000 of these acres, was actually acquired by the Nature Conservancy in the late 1990s. This land was imminently threatened. There was a pending logging contract on this land. So they do what they've done so well for all of these years, which is they go out, they raise money from local philanthropists, and they go buy this land to protect it from developers and loggers. And at the time, according to an archived version of the Nature Conservancy's website, when they were proudly announcing this deal, they said, these threats have been abated because of this acquisition by the Nature Conservancy. So it's really interesting now, fast forward 2 decades to earlier this year when they put forward this carbon project. And if you look through it, this land is a key part of that carbon project. And what they're now saying is this land is now, once again, imminently threatened. 72% of the trees are going to be cut within 5 years. Now, this is just astounding because this land is owned by the Nature Conservancy. They do not clear-cut land that they've bought through philanthropic donations. So this scenario that they've put forward to get carbon revenues is not really plausible. And what that means is when you have Disney coming in and buying these credits, when it eventually lowers its carbon footprint because of these credits, well, that won't be a credible or truthful claim by Disney. So this is an organization that truly understands the threat of the issue of climate change and is wanting to do its part to address this. However, in this situation, it just appears their drive, which they've had for decades, to increase the amount of revenues that it can use for land preservation work, Nature Conservancy and many others see that the carbon credits as a pot of money that they can tap into to further their own benevolent aims. But unfortunately, what this has resulted in is claims of climate progress that just aren't really happening. So the Nature Conservancy defends vigorously these deals, and they and others will say, look, our projects are just following the rules that these registries set up. So some would also put some of the blame on the registries themselves because they're setting up the rules which allow these vapid projects to get up and sold. So we've reached out to all of the companies we mentioned in this story, including Disney. They didn't want to be interviewed for this story, but they all told us that, look, we have to rely on the experts out there, and those experts, they say, are these carbon registries that have been set up. Most of these Nature Conservancy deals are set up and sold on this exchange. It's called the American Carbon Registry. Now, it's the oldest of these registries that allow voluntary carbon credits to be sold. They've been around since 1996. What these offset registries do is they set up rules, and any carbon offset project has to follow those rules. But there's this tension that's always there. If the rules are too strict, then it's going to be very hard for carbon offset projects to get up and running. So there's this balance going on where the registries want rules that attract projects, but they don't want it to be so strict where it will disincentivize projects from getting listed.
One of the challenges with designing carbon offset systems is that there are normally two people at the table. You have buyers and you have sellers. And to some extent, you have policymakers, but you know, the buyers and the sellers are really the ones with the expertise, with the incentive to really participate hard, make a lot of things happen. And the challenge there is that both of them sort of want the same thing, or they're both happy with the same thing. They're happy with low-cost offsets and a lot of them, because that works for their business model. You end up, though, with nobody really representing the atmosphere, so to speak. Nobody's really representing the climate in those discussions. And so the policies end up biasing the whole system. And you end up in sort of a race to the bottom. And that's what we've seen happen. You know, when it comes specifically to the topic of carbon offsets, you know, I am a fan of carbon offsets in the sense that they can help mitigate climate change. They absolutely can. But, you know, if we're not going to do it correctly in a way that actually does help mitigate climate change, then it's nothing but a distraction. And, you know, after 30 years, you have to start wondering, is it really just a distraction? And that's really unfortunate, but that's where we are. Ultimately, what needs to happen is systemic change. You know, we're sort of nibbling around the edges with some of these different things. We need to change how we produce energy. We need to change how we transport ourselves. We need to change what and how we eat. You know, we need systemic change associated with transitioning to a low carbon economy. A lot of what we're doing today is not promoting systemic change. It's sort of trying to stick your thumb in the dike to preserve the current system. And at the end of the day, that can't really work.
the Hyperloop. There's a good chance you've heard the name by now.
This is the Hyperloop system. It can take people hundreds of miles in minutes.
The Hyperloop, a series of tubes that would transport people in pods at ultra-high speeds over long distances.
This is a remarkable new form of transportation that can whisk people from city to city in a flash.
29 minutes from New York to D.C., 30 minutes from L.A. to San Francisco.
For years, we've been seeing these futuristic, utopian renderings of some cross between a spaceship and a monorail. But lately, the Hyperloop is becoming much more real.
Yes. It was surreal to be even sitting inside a Hyperloop, and just even more incredible to actually be like riding down a track in something that was nothing more than a crazy idea 6 years before.
Companies all around the world have been developing and testing the technology needed to propel passengers at speeds of over 1,000 kilometers per hour. But for many, speed is only the first step to unlocking the full transformational effects of a new mode of transportation.
Fast is what we just sort of take for granted in the Hyperloop world. It's the network effects that really deliver the benefit. And that opens up a completely different scale of economic opportunity.
We've got planes, trains, automobiles, and boats for getting around Earth. But what if there was a fifth mode? And I have a name for it, which is called the Hyperloop.
The Hyperloop?
Hyperloop, yeah.
In 2013, while riding high on the growing success of Tesla and SpaceX, entrepreneur Elon Musk released a white paper outlining the basic framework of the technology he called Hyperloop. The basic idea goes a little something like this. A tube reduces the air pressure to a near vacuum-like environment. A Hyperloop pod is then suspended in the tube, usually by magnetic levitation. The whole pod can then be propelled forward. Because there's no traditional friction sources like air resistance or rolling friction that would push back against the pod, the Hyperloop is able to move at incredibly high speeds and do so fairly efficiently. Despite its futuristic name, however, the general concept behind Hyperloop is actually pretty old. In fact, New York City's first attempt at an underground public transit system in the 1870s was based on a similar principle. The pneumatic transit system was short-lived, however, only stretching one block and topping out at a rather leisurely 10 miles per hour. While Elon would make some 21st century improvements to this concept and bestow a very 21st century name, he wouldn't end up pursuing the technology itself, instead electing to focus his efforts on something a little bit deeper, literally digging the requisite tunnels via his boring company. It would take another billionaire industrialist who dabbles in spaceflight. No, wait, not that one. Yeah, that's the one. After Richard Branson would make a large investment in the company Hyperloop One, it would be renamed to Virgin Hyperloop.
What we've always been trying to do as a company is show that this technology could work, that it could be made safe, and that ultimately it's something that's happening in the next couple of years, not the next 20 years.
Josh Geigel is the co-founder and CEO of Virgin Hyperloop. In a familiar tech startup story, he's seen the project go from a garage to a large-scale testing facility outside of Las Vegas.
So we started building the first kind of Hyperloop system in 2016. We've done a lot of work, about 500 tests that we've done on that over the last 5 years. And what we realized that we need to do is take that technology, show that it can be commercial, so drive the cost down, improve the efficiency, improve the performance. But the key thing is actually making it approachable and safe for individuals.
In order to do that, Josh, along with Virgin's head of passenger experience, Sarah Lucian, bravely volunteered to take the inaugural ride.
What her and I were realizing is we're the first two people sitting in a Hyperloop. The only type of people that have gone through this environment are in spacesuits, and there we are in just normal clothes because of the system, the safety of what we've designed.
3, 2, 1, launch.
And then once we started going, you felt a bit of acceleration. We accelerated a little bit harder than we would in commercial. It'd be like a sports car. Yes. We got to about 108 miles an hour on that test. And it's a short run. It's about 500 yards or so. And came to a stop.
The test, lasting only about 20 seconds and covering only a quarter of a mile at just over 100 miles per hour, is a long way away from a true functioning Hyperloop. But as for optics, it's a crucial step for the future of funding.
The number one question we got from investors or from project proponents or just people in general was like, is a Hyperloop safe? And what better way to show something is safe than by actually getting people on it?
But convincing investors and governments that would likely be fronting some of the construction costs for an unproven technology is no easy task. First and foremost is the question of safety.
Most people don't know how an airplane works, but yet they get on an airplane. They get on an airplane because, it's faster than driving, and most importantly, they've probably gotten off of one before, they've seen someone get off of one before. And so what we set out to do was actually show that Hyperloop could be safe with two normal people, not astronauts, not adrenaline junkies or test pilots or anything like that. Two normal people getting on a Hyperloop, and then most importantly, those two people getting off.
But beyond safety concerns, constructing Hyperloops will undoubtedly require a significant capital investment to the estimated tune of around $60 million per kilometer of track. So a track from San Francisco to Los Angeles, for example, is likely to come with a price tag over $10 billion. And before large governments are willing to come in and front those costs, investors who are funding Hyperloop development must accept it as a long-term mixture of technology and infrastructure investing.
Investors that are used to short returns because you're developing apps or something to that effect, those aren't the investors that really get excited about Hyperloop. What you start to see is the people that are looking at platform technologies, right? So this idea that because the smartphone existed, Uber could exist, right? So who are like the Vanderbilts of this century? And that's the part where you're going to get a lot more no's than yeses. But those people that have the ability, the fortitude to stick it out, to see the game-changing platform here, those are the people that we're looking for. And since we've done that passenger test, there has been a lot of interest that's really, this is a lot sooner than I thought.
Envisioning the ripple effects of what Hyperloop could achieve, though, is fairly challenging at this stage of development. It's fast, yes, but for point-to-point travel, traditional maglev trains can move pretty fast as well. And outside of China, South Korea, and Japan, even those haven't seen much adoption elsewhere due to the high costs and questionable profitability. The Shanghai line in China, for example, loses around $100 million every year. Hyperloop companies, however, believe they can offer something different than traditional railway lines.
My name's Alan James, and as far as I know, I'm the only guy on the planet who's written a government-level business case for 300 kmh conventional high-speed rail, 500 kmh maglev, and 1,000 kmh Hyperloop. It's fundamentally about moving people from where they are to where they want to go, when they want to make those journeys, and doing it in much smaller numbers. So pod designs for Hyperloop range from 12 to 28 seats, typically. Why are they small? It's because small enables the network to operate flexibly. And a great example of that is the east-west strategic route across the north of England, from Liverpool to Manchester to Leeds. So to get from Liverpool via Manchester to Leeds by train is just short of 2 hours today. It'll probably take you 2 hours driving as well in average traffic conditions. Net result is those three city regions remain three separate entities: Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds. There's very little commuting traffic between those urban areas. Hyperloop absolutely changes that from the ground up. Liverpool to Manchester is a 5 or 6 minute journey. Manchester to Leeds is also a 5 or 6 minute journey. What that effectively does is create a single supercity economy.
In this vision, the Hyperloop acts a little more like a highway, where pods have fixed destinations and don't need to stop along the way. Meaning you can travel on a Hyperloop network from, say, Liverpool to Leeds, while the pod behind you travels from Liverpool to Manchester. And if that metro Hyperloop network is connected to other networks from the same location, you could travel from Liverpool to Paris or Liverpool to Amsterdam, all without making a single stop.
For passengers, for business, for leisure, that is utterly transformational. For high-value freight and logistics, it's equally transformational. But critically, if you do a Hyperloop network at scale, you begin to deliver massively significant carbon savings too.
A multi-regional Hyperloop network could become a replacement for both short-haul passenger and cargo flights and traditional ground transportation, both of which are significant carbon producers.
One Hyperloop-connected distribution hub, perhaps at an airport that is predominantly used for international air freight, replacing maybe 10, 12, 15 distributed road hubs. It takes a lot of polluting and inefficient truck haulage off the roads. That itself means roads gain extra capacity.
Hyperloops will still need to use electricity to both move pods and maintain the near-vacuum environment in the tube. Proponents of the technology believe that this can be done by using renewable sources, including a combination of solar panels and battery technology that could be used along the Hyperloop itself. But even with all multipliers of time and carbon emission savings that a Hyperloop network may provide, the investment capital required to actually build such a network becomes even more economically and politically daunting.
Committing doesn't mean spending billions on day one. Committing means, how do we phase it?
One company in the Netherlands is working to develop that technology, and perhaps more importantly, the international coalition needed to make the Hyperloop network a reality.
So we are here in Europe's first full-scale Hyperloop test facility, where we can already prove every conceptual technology of the Hyperloop.
This is Tim Houter, a co-founder and CEO of Hart Hyperloop, headquartered in the city of Delft. And while this testing tube might not seem as large as others, inside is a key technology to create the on- and off-ramp type infrastructure of a Hyperloop network. That is, a lane switch.
That's something we can already test here. You can actually see it here, that the track is diverging from one track into two. That makes it possible to eventually split up the Hyperloop track in two sections. And in that sense, you can create a complete Hyperloop network. But in the end, will make it possible to travel, for example, over a whole continent. Take Europe, for example, with the same ease as you can now travel with a metro in a city.
The nice thing about this magnetic levitation system that we've developed is that there's absolutely zero moving components in the track. So, for example, if you have to do a lane switch, all you do is that the tube basically splits up, and statically the tracks also split up. And whenever the vehicle enters a switch, it either pulls itself to the right with its magnets, or it pulls itself to the left with its magnets.
Lane switching on traditional rail requires the physical movement of the rail. Even modern magnetic levitation tracks use lane switching techniques in order to transfer trains from one track to another.
And this is a very crucial element, because this is the thing that limits the capacity and, in the end, the usefulness of the rail network. Because the moment that a track is switching, that means that at that moment you are creating an unsafe environment for the trains behind it. So you need a lot of space between trains. But in a Hyperloop, because you have no moving components in the track, all the vehicles can be much closer to each other. You can achieve a very high frequency and basically have your vehicles moving and merging in and out of the network very much like a highway.
For now, though, Hart's physical testing has been limited by the size of their tube. Because the test track is only 30 meters long, they haven't tested this lane switch at speeds greater than 20 kilometers per hour. However, the company is working to build a new test site where it plans to increase that testing speed to 300 kilometers per hour.
We're now in a phase where we have proven most of the most important technologies in the test facilities that we already have. And we have also demonstrated the viability and the feasibility of a network. If you look at all the subsystems that it consists of, most of those are proven systems, already demonstrated in lab conditions. So we don't really believe that the technology itself is going to be the biggest challenge.
Because for all Hyperloop companies out there, actually building a Hyperloop system requires more than just a good product.
We're talking about the safety aspects, we're talking about integration into the environment, we're talking about the social aspects. Do people feel comfortable traveling in such a system? So it's about all these different aspects, and the complexity is really getting all the different stakeholders that are relevant and that do need to contribute to bring this to market, to get them all following the same roadmap.
In order to help build this coalition of private and public interest in Hyperloop development, HART in 2018 partnered with other Hyperloop companies from Europe and Canada. The goal was to define, establish, and standardize the framework to regulate Hyperloop systems.
Right now we are working with all the Hyperloop developers together in setting up the first, let's say, structure for starting the standards drafting.
One of the most important goals for HART is interoperability, which is essentially making sure the different systems can communicate with each other.
Interoperability is so important because what we want to achieve is actually have this seamless travel experience. So you don't want to end up, for example, going from Madrid to Paris and then switching because you need to use a different technology to get, for example, to Amsterdam.
The idea being that as companies around Europe create the first commercial Hyperloop tracks between individual cities, one day those can all be connected to a larger network.
Everyone that believes that Hyperloop is a future transport system also realizes that there is a need to have this network because that's where Hyperloop thrives.
Hyperloop is such a huge project. It's definitely not something that you can do on your own or as a single company. So you need to do it with a lot of other companies. You need to have the governments. And I think in that sense, the biggest challenge that we've encountered is to really get all the required parties together to take the steps in development and in commercial implementation.
HART's next plan is to build the European Hyperloop Center, an open testing facility which will include a 2.6-kilometer test track. And the company hopes to test travel speeds there at up to 700 kilometers per hour. Virgin Hyperloop is also racing to construct the first commercial Hyperloop route, with projects in various states of development in India, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Recently, the company announced plans to build a Hyperloop certification center in West Virginia, which will include a 6-mile-long test track. Proving the technology here will be crucial if Hyperloop networks can find a home among infrastructure investments that the Biden administration hopes to make.
The idea that there's multiple Hyperloop companies, I think, is a redeeming aspect in the business. People really want to see something happen, so having multiple people move forward is good for that.
I was struck when Josh and Sarah rode the pod. 2 or 3 of the major outlets used the phrase, "We now have a new mode of transport." And although all of that technology had existed before those 2 human beings rode it, it was the moment at which those 2 human beings traveled that short distance down the tube that in popular imagination, Hyperloop became a mode of transport.
The metaphor I use with my team is that, the Wright brothers were first, but none of us fly on Wright Brothers Airlines anymore. If you don't continue to innovate, you're not going to be around, and so we'll continue to be at the forefront of building Hyperloop.
Back in 2013, Elon had an idea. I think the difference now in 2021 is some brilliant engineers have spent real time grinding out the details. And I thoroughly expect the next 3 to 5 years to be decisive.
This week, how hydrogen can transform our energy usage. We'll look at why the universe's most abundant element could be a game changer in the climate revolution.
Hydrogen technologies are not new. They are used in other sectors. We use them in space, on our rockets, and we don't need the laws of physics to change to be able to use hydrogen on our planes.
From iron ore to green hydrogen, one of Australia's richest men tells us about his pivot to sustainable energy.
Let's take action. It's practical, it's implementable. Let's do it now.
Plus, the hydrogen revolution. We'll speak with the CEO of Italian utilities firm Snam about his new book and how green hydrogen could be competitive within 5 years.
Costs are coming down and people are waking up to the fact that it's the only way to decarbonize certain sectors.
From Bloomberg's global headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and this is Bloomberg Green. It's a new year, so here at Bloomberg Green, we're highlighting new solutions in the fight against climate change. And one of those is as old as the universe itself, hydrogen. It's the simplest element around, but could well be a game changer when it comes to turning around our dependence on fossil fuels. Today, hydrogen is used in the chemicals industry to produce petroleum products. It's also starting to be used in steel production, an industry under a lot of pressure to decarbonize. But it has far more uses as well, from powering cars to heating our homes. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance sees a seismic shift in the sector in the next 10 years as green hydrogen squeezes out dirtier alternatives. So-called gray hydrogen dominates today. But as renewable electricity gets cheaper and more accessible, so will green hydrogen. In this week's edition of Bloomberg Green, we'll explore what this push into hydrogen means for tackling climate change. We'll hear from Australian billionaire Twiggy Forrest about his pivot from iron ore to hydrogen, and we'll also speak with the CEO of Italian utility company Snam about his book, The Hydrogen Revolution. But first, what are we using hydrogen for? And why does it actually matter? Christine Lee Edwards explains.
Hydrogen, the most plentiful element in the universe.
On Earth, we find it mostly bonded to oxygen in the form of water, or in other gases known as hydrocarbons. Hydrogen gas, H2, burns hot and clean, making it an attractive tool in the race to net zero. But isolating hydrogen from other elements is no easy task. Today, the cheapest way to do this is via chemical processes that break up natural gas. This releases a lot of carbon dioxide. Another method is to use electricity to split water molecules in a process called electrolysis. Although there is no carbon byproduct, a lot of electricity is needed. And if this power comes from burning coal or gas, it negates the zero emissions goals of using hydrogen to begin with. Hydrogen produced in this way, powered by fossil fuels, is called gray hydrogen. If carbon capture and storage is used together with fossil fuels, then it becomes blue hydrogen. If nuclear power is used, it's called pink. And finally, green hydrogen is when it's produced via electrolysis and powered from renewable sources. This method is considered emissions-free. It's predicted that by the early 2030s, H2 made from renewables will be cheaper than that made from fossil fuels. But that hinges on the cost of electrolysis declining, which will be achieved through larger projects and an expansion of manufacturing. To be clear, vast amounts of H2 are already used today. Global production in 2018 totaled 117 million metric tons. This hydrogen is mostly used for its chemical properties, not as a source of energy, and very little of it is clean. Some sectors like steel could start using hydrogen for these chemical properties, replacing coal. Industries like cement and glass may also use hydrogen as a source of heat. Another advantage is its energy storage potential. It can be stored over long periods of time and used when more power needs to be added to the grid. It also could hold an advantage over batteries in heavy transport and shipping. The promise of hydrogen for energy has been around since at least 1874, when Jules Verne wrote about it in his book, The Mysterious Island. But the future of hydrogen will depend on policy. Countries with net zero targets, carbon pricing, and hydrogen strategies with investment mechanisms are likely to see the highest H2 demand.
That was Bloomberg's Christine Lee Edwards explaining what hydrogen means for the energy transition. But how are businesses approaching the sector? Well, one of Australia's richest men is making a big play into hydrogen. Andrew Forrest, better known as Twiggy, made his fortune from iron ore, being the chairman, former CEO, and major shareholder in Fortescue Metals, one of the world's biggest miners. But after having made over $10 billion in profit from the metal in the last fiscal year, Twiggy wants to transform Fortescue into a clean energy company. He's been scouring the planet in search of investment opportunities in hydrogen and renewables. The firm plans to allocate up to 10% of its annual profits for green energy investments and is exploring projects across the globe, from Indonesia to Argentina. Francine Lacqua caught up with Twiggy Forrest.
There's only one type of clean hydrogen, all the rest is dirty.
Yeah.
That is green. If you just say green hydrogen is clean, the rest is dirty, then you've actually nailed it. And, you know, anyone else who produces any other rubbish, any other argument, just look them there and say, why is global warming accelerating if anything you're saying is true? And then you'll know, actually, it's greenwashing.
Yeah, but there's a lot of greenwashing because I keep on being told it's a transition. We can't just, make the transition at a click of a finger. So what are we doing wrong? What can we do better?
I don't remember the personal computer having to transition the typewriter. I really don't remember that. I don't remember the smartphone having to transition the pocket calculator and the old landline. You know, its transition line is complete rubbish. The lie got put to it 2 days ago when JCB, a really loved British company, every right for the country to be proud of JCB, and Fortescue, holding a bit of a similar reputation, fantastic track record, everyone's done super well from Fortescue, huge balance sheet, super strong. When those two companies got together and agreed a $7 to $9 billion US agreement per annum, right, then that's a real wake-up call to say, hang on, green hydrogen is obviously commercial now. You know, every other form of fossil fuel hydrogen, you know, it can compete with it on price, it can probably lose on price, but what we know, it is cooking the planet. And only green hydrogen zero methane, zero carbon in the supply chain. Don't worry about the molecules in the supply chain.
But at the moment, we're not even phasing out coal, if you look at the G20 communique. So we have a long way to go to talk about only using green hydrogen.
Yeah, so look, I have a call, which I'd like to make now, that the world should not fund any more coal-fired power stations, coal mining projects, ever. We should wind them down as quickly as possible because they are cooking the planet just like grey and blue hydrogen is cooking the planet.
Yeah.
You know, hydrogen, which is not made from renewable electricity, is releasing 10 to 16 times more carbon, let alone the methane, which is worse, than it is hydrogen. So we've just got to stop doing things which are self-harming under the guise of greenwashing.
So why are leaders so slow? Even if you look at the appetite for ESG investments, they're growing exponentially, so are emissions. So where are we allocating capital?
Okay, so take the recent G20. There's probably a reason why there wasn't strong action coming out of the G20 because people were not aware that major transactions between large companies were taking place now on green hydrogen, that actually this pollution-free all the way through the supply chain fuel is now being transacted at multi-billion-dollar scale. If they'd known that, I don't believe any sovereign leader or any energy minister or climate change minister could not take ultra seriously that green hydrogen is now here to stay. It's broken through. History has been made. It will never go back.
Okay, what is the one thing that you would tell leaders today and business leaders? How do we transition faster than what we are now because we're at real risk of missing our targets?
Oh, so that's really simple. You stop funding, you stop subsidizing, you stop using money into fossil fuels. It could be carbon sequestration, it could be fuel rebates, could be anything. Hundreds of billions of dollars getting ashed while we ash the planet on fossil fuel subsidies. Because we haven't had that renewable electricity, we haven't had that green hydrogen, we've kind of been pushed down. It's all sorts of excuses. Oh, it'll never be commercial, it'll never be supplied in the quantities we need it, you know, blah, blah, blah. Now we know, let's take action. It's practical, it's implementable, let's do it now.
Okay, if we do it now, is there going to be a shock to the energy system? Is there going to be a shock actually to economically? And is it worth, you know, not talking about transition, just going from A to B?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. A to B is the solution. Let fossil fuels do what fossil fuels do. Just burn their coal, burn their oil, burn the gas. At least they're pumping up carbon and methane into the atmosphere, honestly. Well, not that honest because they don't measure methane, which is 90 times worse than carbon. But at least the carbon is being done honestly. Encourage the green hydrogen sector to come in really fast. Okay, it's there. There's renewable power all over the world. We now know how to make electrolyzers much cheaper, like 25% of the original cost. We know how to do that now. We don't have an excuse to get into it.
Does it need to be cheaper than oil and fossil fuel for it to be viable worldwide?
Well, right now it is. Okay, so let's just swallow that bit of financial data. Right now it is cheaper, and it's getting more cheap. It's the only fuel you know of which is declining in value.
You don't have enough of it, right, to power the world?
Yes. That's only because we haven't had policies to support it. If we had policies to support it 5-10 years ago, it would be everywhere. You'd see the global warming budget start to come down. Now, we've got 5 or 10 years to make a huge difference. I need policy leaders all over the world to appreciate now, okay, big business is transacting with green hydrogen in multi-billion-dollar agreements. We now know it's here and it's here to stay. Let's spread it everywhere.
Coming up on the program, the hydrogen revolution. We'll speak with the CEO of Italian utility firm Snam about his new book and why he thinks green hydrogen will be competitive in just 5 years. Plus, how are airlines working to become more sustainable? We'll look at how Airbus plans to step up in the climate fight. This is Bloomberg Green. Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. What will the world look like in 2050? Will global temperatures have stabilized, electric vehicles be abundant, and solar and wind power homes around the world? According to Marco Alvera, the CEO of Italian energy company Snam, that vision of the future could be a reality. And he says that hydrogen will pave its way. As he tells it in his new book, The Hydrogen Revolution, Alvera's moment of reckoning came in November 2018 when he tasked the Snam Scenarios team with studying how Europe could reduce its CO2 emissions to zero by 2050. Looking through the results of the study, Alvera said he was struck by how much hydrogen was in Europe's energy mix by that year. Beyond the abundance of hydrogen, the Snam model also predicted that it would be the cheapest form of decarbonized energy for many sectors, and that it could be cheaper than today's prices for oil, coal, and nuclear power. Our Maria Tadeo spoke with Alvera at COP26.
It's happening all very fast. We see the cost of hydrogen coming down a lot. Hydrogen will play a big role in the energy mix. I don't know if it's going to be 15 or 25% of a fully decarbonized energy system, but it's going to be big. Costs are coming down, and people are waking up to the fact that it's the only way to decarbonize certain sectors, the so-called hard-to-abate sectors.
And you say it's the only way and the costs are coming down. Where do you see prices moving? Because a lot of the reticence at times has to do with the pricing, that some argue, well, it's still not the cheapest option on the market.
So when I was first working in hydrogen in 2004, it was costing $1,000 per megawatt hour. 2010, 600. Today, 100, and we see it going down to 50 in 5 years' time, and to going down to $25 per megawatt hour in the next 10 years or so, which is a quarter of where it is today. That's really because renewable energy, and we're talking green hydrogen here, renewable energy costs are falling, but the cost of making the electrolyzer, which is the kit that you use to convert solar or wind energy and water into hydrogen, the cost of this kit is falling a lot because it doesn't really exist on an industrial scale. So as we build up capacity, we industrialize it, we standardize it, and we squeeze costs out. That's really the cost trajectory.
And for that, of course, you need demand, however, for governments and also institutions to kind of buy into this idea that it is the future and we want to invest and create infrastructure. What are they telling you? When you speak to governments, when you speak to officials, are they keen on this?
They're very keen. So the Department of Energy shares our view in the States of getting to below $1 a kilo, which is $25 a megawatt hour. The European Union has a hydrogen strategy, which is very clear, and several member states have the same. Chile wants to export a lot of hydrogen. China's big on hydrogen. Australia's very big on hydrogen. Japan is blending already hydrogen. So I would say the world is now really focused on this because it's the only way to store energy for a long period of time economically is to convert it into either a liquid or a gas.
And of course, you talk about the price, but the other big component is the volume. You know, how big can you go? Where do you see that on a time scale?
So wherever it's sunny or windy, you can produce very cheap hydrogen eventually. And so compared to oil and gas, which are concentrated in few parts of the world, it's going to be very democratic from that point of view. So every sunny place, every desert, every ocean wind can be turned into hydrogen that we can put on ships, in pipes, and really start trading it around the world. So it's going to happen a lot faster than a lot of people think.
So, and when you say a lot faster, what is that in time?
As I said, $50, which is essentially oil parity within 5 years. And then, depending on how quickly we ramp it up after that, we could get to $25, which is coal parity before the end of the decade.
And in big scale.
In big scale, because once you get to coal parity, that's the only way we're going to get China and India to stop burning new coal. We have businesses in China and in India, and I see a lot of hydrogen development, a lot of renewable development in both countries. The India announcement was incredibly strong on 2030. Some people were upset about the 2017 net zero deadline, but when it comes to 30, he announced a big, big commitment to get to 50% renewables.
Were you surprised by it?
I was surprised that they would make it so explicit, and even the net zero is a big thing for them. And so I think it will happen faster than 2070 because of the falling cost of renewable and hydrogen. India's burning 80 gigawatt of oil, of diesel, to keep the lights on. So there's an immediate opportunity there, and we're very interested in working in that country.
And with regards to China, perhaps the fact that we haven't really seen them active, I guess the diplomats are working on this, but we haven't really seen the leadership.
It's going to be technology, it's going to be industry. I think China has committed to a net zero, which is very important. At the G20, China was clearly behind the 1.5 degrees. So I think a lot has been achieved between the G20.
Perhaps stronger view than she needed to, that she really shouldn't say anything about politics. Charles, when he was younger, certainly did try to put in a word, and that gets you into moments of controversy, particularly on architecture, for example. He was he has tried to stick an oar in. That will be interesting. He doesn't have the utterly above the fray image that the Queen was able to generate over the years, and that could create constitutional issues. The other is that while I don't think the issue of democracy has really entered into it for the simple reason that if you were to put the Queen's, the ongoing monarchy to a vote in a referendum, it was obvious that the monarchy would win very comfortably. They did have the consent of the governed. I don't know yet. I fear that you might see that begin to shift now that we no longer have the Queen who has embodied the monarchy for so long.
Yeah. John, of course, thank you. You're going to be sticking with us. Guy Johnson, you too, as well, joining us from London. It was interesting when John was speaking, we were showing some of the key events that the Queen had overseen throughout this huge tenure of her reign. One of those that really stood out to me was really sort of balancing the neutrality and the politics of it all, getting through multiple prime ministers when we think about Winston Churchill to just the latest that your own UK god Elizabeth Truss just a few weeks ago. Balancing that while not sort of getting involved with politics either. How did she manage that?
She had a very close connection to politics. As we were hearing in Caroline's piece just a moment ago, she spoke regularly, weekly, with the Prime Minister. She kept her finger on the pulse. She had an understanding of what was happening. So to say that she was completely removed from politics, that there was clear blue water between her and the political system, I think is probably stretching it a little bit. I think she understood the nuance of what was happening in her government. And I think while she may not have directly guided the process, I think she was listened to, and her thoughts were welcomed when they were given. We don't know what those conversations were like. They were behind closed doors. There were no people listening. There was no idea of what was said. But I think she had a connection to politics that was always there and was consistent. And in some ways, that was why the process in some ways was as smooth as it was. There was always this process, outgoing Prime Minister, incoming Prime Minister, of visiting the Queen. She was the consistency throughout this entire process. So while she wasn't directly involved with politics, I think she was embedded within the system and certainly had a great understanding of what was happening.
And Francine, to that end, the consistency that was 15 prime ministers in the United Kingdom and 14 US presidents. I'm surprised to learn she only ever didn't meet one of them, Lyndon Johnson. The rest, she met every single other 14 of those US presidents. And really, for international leaders, she was someone who they sort of admired and looked up to, with the fact that she had such a consistent manner, the way in which that she was able, remarkably, to remain so focused and not get embroiled in political skirmishes. Francine.
Is with a country, for example, if there was differences where the two countries did not get along with the UK, they'd say, we should do a royal visit because she became a national treasure. And people, different from all walks of life, from all religions, from all over the world, actually would be impressed by being received by the Queen. And from what we're told, insiders, she had a great sense of humor. So actually, a lot of people saw her as formal, and certainly she was that. But she could also turn and play with heads of state in a very elegant manner. And I'm sure some of them didn't realize, but she certainly spoke her mind in a very subdued, very British way. Now, there are, of course, a lot of these several plans put in place to ensure that her return to London also is something ceremonial, bequest of, a queen with her stature. I mean, I was reminded, Caroline, and this is really quite incredible, she met Winston Churchill, right? If you think about what he represented in history, and her godfather was born in 1850 or thereabouts. I mean, she has lived through almost, 2 centuries, and the things she's seen will be greatly, greatly missed by future prime ministers of the UK who could have learned something from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, a lot has been written about her sense of humor, and I
I don't know if it was you, Guy, who just a minute ago was sort of referencing her sort of simulated parachuting in, of course, with James Bond. I think we all got a nice chuckle out of that. And she has certainly shown that side of her from time to time, some great anecdotes, of course, about her rapport with various heads of states over the year. Maybe you can give us a little insight here, Guy, as to sort of what we can expect right now with regards to the recognition of her life, the funeral, and of course the succession that will come over the next few days and weeks.
The succession is already in place, Romain. It is King Charles. That is an instantaneous process. We will wait for the coronation to come after the funeral. The funeral, my understanding is, will probably take place in 10 days' time. And during the next 10 days, a series of events will unfold that will be a recognition of her life. She is at Balmoral now. She will go to Edinburgh. She will ultimately come to London over the next 24 hours. We will see Parliament being returned as well. Parliament needs to swear allegiance to the new king. We also need to see a vote on the new king. So that whole process, that constitutional process, will unfold over the next few days. Clearly, there will be a huge outpouring as well from the British people. This is a bereavement for Britain. Britain is bereaved. This is kind of where we are in this. She was so central to all of us that there will be a huge outpouring of grief as a result of this. I suspect it may not be as emotionally obvious as it was when Princess Diana died, but this is a huge change. Let's not underestimate that for the UK. And this will ultimately build up to the state funeral that will take place in 10 days' time. But the British monarchy has been preparing for this. It will be run by the Norfolks, but the king ultimately will have a say on what happens. He will have the ultimate say on what happens over the next few days. But certainly this is a process that has been prepared for over many years.
Francine, I want to come to you quickly as well. As we think about some of the international reaction that we get as well, a UN chief, of course, calling Elizabeth Grace dignity, dedication. We're hearing from the Irish president, calling her a remarkable friend of Ireland. We're hearing from France, India, EU. I mean, the list really goes on. What do you make of this international support?
Well, she was loved by all, Kayla, and of course she was loved by all, by many people. As Caroline was explaining before, it wasn't always a smooth reign. She was not always, on everyone's side, or not everyone was behind her having some riches. But in the last 10 years, you can't say that she was one of the most beloved heads of state in the world. And if you look at the place of the UK right now, certainly with fights with France, with Europe over the Northern-Irish protocol, there was always a sense, certainly from the French side, that the Queen represented something fair, that we never knew whether she was for or against Brexit, but there was, she wanted what was best for her country, and she would always look after the interests of her country. Just 10 days ago, I don't know if you remember, Liz Truss, before becoming Prime Minister, said something about she wasn't sure whether Emmanuel Macron was a friend or a foe. This has, we understand, smoothed over and patched over. But at the time, or back then, you could have imagined if Queen Elizabeth didn't pick up the phone to people, a quiet word, maybe, with the Prime Minister on that event would have probably gone a long way.
Francine, yes, indeed. And we're pleased to say, of course, Guy, John, Francine being here with immediate reaction. We also want to bring in now Frank Mort. He's Professor of Cultural Histories. He's currently at the University of Manchester, author of numerous books, History of Modern Britain. I know that in particular you're writing about the British monarchy. Frank, this moment of passing and what you think it means for the British people, that stiff upper lip that we all know so well.
Well, I do think a momentous chapter of British history has closed, and of course, a life has passed, and I would extend my sympathy to the members of the royal family, to the new King and Queen. What does it mean? Well, I think one of the things we can do is go back to 1953, and then fast forward to today, and think about how British society has changed over the 70 years of the Queen's reign. I mean, 1953, the end of empire. the beginnings of the welfare state, the rise of mass consumer society, youth culture, then the free market, celebrity culture, and into the problems of the present decade. The Queen has lived through all of this, and I think one of the most significant things about her reign is that she has promoted very strongly the idea of change within continuity. So the idea that a continuous developmental form for the monarchy, which preserves tradition, has been meshed with some very adroit changes taking place over the 70 years. Just let me give a few examples of that. 1953, the coronation. There was no guarantee that it was going to be on television. And indeed, the Queen's better instincts felt that it shouldn't be. And many members of the social elite also said that. But she did it. She did it on the advice of Churchill and her ministers. Early 1970s, firstly in New Zealand, she went walkabout, a new approach to the monarchy, a new sense of informality, of making herself and her family more accessible. And then more recently, she moved very quickly in terms of acknowledging public feeling over the death of Princess Diana. She came down to London. She sensed the public mood. And I would say one of the things about the Queen, rather like...
How much more could you put as a final point on an incredible reign than 2 days before she died? She did her duty.
So well put. The quintessence in many ways of Queen Elizabeth II. And you think of the span of history from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss. That's quite a span. Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador, for being with us. That's Kay Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. And now that will do it for Balance of Power. I'm going to turn it over to Bloomberg Business Week and Tim Stenovic and Katie Greifeld. Welcome.
Thank you so much, David. Usually we begin our program with a look at the markets, but this is not a usual day. We are live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio in New York. Good afternoon to our audience around the world on YouTube, on SiriusXM, and in Boston on Bloomberg 106.1 to this special edition of Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Tim Stenovic. Katie Greifeld is in this afternoon for Carol Nasser. As you've been hearing here on Bloomberg Radio just a half hour ago, Buckingham Palace announced that Britain's longest-serving monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, has died. She died peacefully at her summer residence in Balmoral, Scotland. This afternoon, on September 8th, she was 96 years old. She ascended the throne back in 1952, and she led the UK through a time of political upheaval. She began her reign as head of an empire, albeit one that was in decline, and by the time of her death, the future of the UK itself was in doubt, with recurrent calls for independence in Scotland and Britain's exit from the EU, leading to renewed tension in Northern Ireland. She became the UK's longest-serving monarch and was queen for 70 years. On our program this afternoon, we'll be joined by our reporters in the UK, around the world, here in the United States as well, to reflect on the legacy of Queen Elizabeth and really get an understanding for what happens next. There are serious implications about the future of the United Kingdom and what the government will look like moving forward and what the monarchy will look like moving forward. It also happens at a transitional time with a new prime minister in the United Kingdom. Very pleased this afternoon to be joined by Katie Greifeld. She's live with me in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Katie, I know this is something that you and I have spent a lot of time reading up on today, this afternoon, when we did first hear that the Buckingham Palace was concerned about the Queen's health.
And it struck me, I was listening to John Authors on Bloomberg Television earlier. He made the point that at 56 years old, he's never known anyone other than Queen Elizabeth serving as monarch. And that's true for the majority of the British population, with more than 70 years on the throne. She has really overseen the country, the Commonwealth, and really the world through just a dizzying array of events.
70 years. It's an incredible amount of time. She became a few years ago the longest-serving monarch. Here in the United States, President Biden said, quote, "Our hearts and our thoughts go to their family members of the Queen, goes to the people of the United Kingdom." I don't want to get ahead of what the president is going to say. This is from the White House, I should say. But as I said earlier, our relationship with the people of the United Kingdom, and this is something that the president has said himself, has grown stronger and stronger. The United Kingdom is one of our closest allies, and again, our hearts go to the people of the United Kingdom, to the Queen, and to her family. Right now, I want to go to the UK and bring in Bloomberg Daybreak Europe banker Stephen Carroll, who joins us on the phone from London. Stephen, before we get to legacy, what happens next? You're on the ground in London right now. Just give us an idea of what things are like there.
Well, I mean, the crowds have been gathering from this afternoon outside Buckingham Palace. There's a lot of people pointing out that a rainbow had appeared over Buckingham Palace and over Windsor Castle as well, as we've had a lot of rain in London this afternoon, and that appeared at the moment the statement came out from Buckingham Palace that the Queen had indeed passed. We've actually just in the past few minutes had a statement from the King, King Charles, as he now becomes, saying the death of my beloved mother, Her Majesty the Queen, is a moment of the greatest sadness for me and all the members of my family. We mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother. I know her loss will be deeply felt throughout the country, the realms and the Commonwealth, and by countless people around the world. During this period of mourning and change, my family and I will be comforted and sustained by our knowledge of the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held. The first statement from the King after the passing of Queen Elizabeth, and it is now the beginning of 10 days of mourning here in the UK. Regular business has been suspended. Flags have been lowered to half-mast at Buckingham Palace, but at Downing Street as well, where the Prime Minister operates from, and at all government buildings across the UK. This is an absolutely enormous shock and change for this country. Of course, the Queen was 96 years old. We know that she hasn't been very well recently. That was one of the reasons why the handover of power ceremony that happened earlier this week happened at Balmoral and not elsewhere, but the Queen would normally have travelled to London for that, but it was said that she had mobility issues, so she wasn't able to travel, and then there was an event she was meant to attend on Wednesday evening, virtually from Balmoral, but it was said that she was not well enough to be able to attend that, and obviously overnight there had been a serious deterioration in her condition, which led to the statement this afternoon, London time, 12:30 here in London, to say that she was under medical supervision, and 6 hours later we had the official statement from the palace that she had passed away. So it is now, for many people, the shock of getting used to life without the Queen. That point that we just heard it from John Authers making it, 70 years on the throne means an awful lot of people in this country don't remember anything else. And the idea that there is now a king, but also that one of the constants in the system of government in this country, because the Queen is head of state, has been the constant through all of the political turmoil that happens, regular and irregular, that we've seen in recent years here. 15 prime ministers. She just appointed the most recent Liz Truss just on Tuesday of this week. She's had, I think it's 14 US presidents have served in the same time that she has been on the throne, but the office lives on. That now passes to Charles and the Queen Consort, Camilla, who will now take over that leading royal position here in the UK.
And before we get to that turnover, like you said, it's not until 10 days from now that we get the state funeral at Westminster Abbey. Walk us through the next 10 days and what to expect.
Yeah, this is the plan known as Operation London Bridge, which has been in place, as you can imagine, for a long time. The UK officially enters a 10-day mourning period from tomorrow. There will be no government announcements made during that period. The King will make a statement to the nation later tomorrow. That is the plan, and full details then will be announced of the state funeral for the Queen. The normal business of Parliament will be suspended. MPs will pay their tributes to the monarch. They'll send condolences, and they will later swear a new oath of allegiance to the King. The Queen's coffin will be returned to London, perhaps by royal train, perhaps by air. That's details we don't have just yet, but that's the plan that is in place. The coffin of the Queen will then be lying in state in Westminster Hall, just as her mother did in 2002 when she died. That was something that was 200,000 people came to view the Queen Mother when she was lying in state for that period. That will last for 5 days before we get the state funeral at Westminster Abbey, and on that day markets will be closed. It will be a national holiday, and there will be 2 minutes of silence observed as well.
Stephen, here we're in the United States. You're in London. Indeed, the world is watching what happens out of the UK today. Can you talk a little bit about the Queen's influence around the world, not just at home, but around the entire globe?
Well, that is the position because of the length of her reign. If you think about the number of world leaders she would have met or entertained, you know, those meetings of international summits of the G7 or NATO or meetings of heads of state and government. And there are occasions at which we have seen the Queen over the years meet with heads of state, as well as, of course, travelling with her Prime Minister, who holds the executive power here in the UK. Her influence, not only, of course, because she is the head of state of 15 countries in the Commonwealth, and of course, the president or the leader of the Commonwealth at the same time, which is a coalition of countries that extends across the world. But also she is a symbol. She is a symbol of this country. She has been something that has not only, of course, entered into cultural memory, as we all know, the many television series and films that have been produced about her as well, but she is a constant in lives all around the world, representing the United Kingdom, representing a tradition and a set of traditions that have lived on in this country for hundreds of years and will now live on through Charles.
Stephen, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want to go now to London, where we have new Prime Minister Liz Truss speaking. Let's listen in.
Time of service. It is a day of great loss, but Queen Elizabeth II leaves a great legacy. Today, the crown passes, as it has done for more than 1,000 years, to our new monarch, our new head of state, His Majesty, King Charles III. With the King's family, we mourn the loss of his mother, and as we mourn, we must come together as a people to support him, to help him bear the awesome responsibility that he now carries for us all. We offer him our loyalty and devotion, just as his mother devoted so much to so many for so long. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, "God save the King."
That was new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, speaking just now in London. God save the Queen. She said that the crown passes for more than 1,000 years. It passes once again, this time from Queen Elizabeth to King Charles. Let's get right back to Stephen Carroll, who is Bloomberg Daybreak anchor, who joins us on the phone in London. Stephen, what did you make of what we just heard from Liz Truss?
Very solemn words from the new Prime Minister. Of course, it's hard to believe only 2 days ago she was making her first speech as Prime Minister of the UK, having been appointed officially by the Queen, as that's how the constitutional process works here. A very somber tone struck by her, as only we would have expected, and the important message being that continuity continues. It is now the King who they will swear their allegiance to. The national anthem subtly changes from God Save the Queen to God Save the King, if you think about that as well. And presenting us with exactly what we would expect from a head of government in this position at this time. You can be sure that this is a long-running plan that has been ready for this, as all of the arrangements which have had to be put in place across government departments. Of course, this is going to be an enormous logistical operation in London as well. I think that Liz Truss, as someone who's only in the job for 2 days, probably didn't expect that she would be making this particular speech so soon. But she did strike that somber tone, and we see her now going back into number 10. Of course, you can see already the subtle changes that have been taking place given the period of national mourning the country is now entering. The crown, the logo on the lectern where she was speaking is black. Of course, that Liz Truss was dressed completely in black as well, and this is the beginning of this formal process of mourning, which continues.
Let's bring in Flavia Kraus-Jackson, managing editor for Bloomberg's U.S. government coverage in our 99.1 studio in Washington, D.C. She was head of UK government coverage, and really want to speak to her about, the relationship that the Queen had with the prime ministers that she worked with over the years. As we just heard from Stephen, 15 prime ministers and met with 13 of the last 14 presidents. Flavia, what's going through your head right now?
Well, to be honest, what's going through my head was Truss's rather extraordinary statement. She just called Charles III, which is actually pretty extraordinary, because it really is up to him to sort of say so. And there was a lot of analysis, informed analysis and speculation that, really he probably wouldn't pick Charles III, given the history. Well, Charles I had his head chopped off. Charles II, the Charles don't have like a great reputation, put it this way, amongst the kings and queens of England. So
does that mean that he...
Well,
what does that mean?
Well, either she misspoke or she knows something that we don't know. But certainly it's worth reflecting on because, both of those are interesting and newsworthy because I think that was going to be something that was going to be decided in coming days, and certainly up to the new king and monarch to announce, not to be sort of slipped out. So it's unclear whether the new prime minister was sort of making an assumption or whether she knew. But it's unusual, put it that way. Which obviously pivots nicely to the relationship that the Queen had with the prime ministers of her age. I mean, there was a formidable and extraordinary piece of theatre, actually, that kind of actually looked into this very thing and looked at all the meetings that she must have had. The very first being Winston Churchill. And some of them she's liked more than others. We've all seen The Crown. But certainly, it's through her eyes, you've seen the complete transformation of the country.
And Flavia, Stephen made the point that the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, probably didn't expect to be making this speech so soon. So it's a period of enormous change for the UK, a new Prime Minister, a new monarch. What does that look like in terms of establishing a relationship between the two? How does this typically go when there is a new king or queen?
I think you're absolutely right. The colossal task ahead of Liz Truss was already enormous, and to be dealing with such a seismic change in the country is certainly not something that she would have been expecting or anticipating so soon. I think we all knew that the Queen was getting on, but there'd been this sort of perception that she could never go, that she was eternal, that she surely she was in good nick and she would hang on. So I think there's the moment of disbelief and gasping. Right now, she needs to get the tone right, and as I just mentioned, this Charles III thing, if indeed she got it wrong, is not a great way to get going with the head of state who's incoming with his own. With the own weight of history, enormous shoes to fill. The Queen was much beloved. A lot of people, have been saying over the years, can the monarchy sort of survive without her? Given who she was, the kind of authority and gravitas that she carried. So enormous shoes to fill for Charles, and also a tricky one for a newly minted and completely inexperienced prime minister to sort of come in cold and have to handle it with the right amount of grace, balance, and tone.
Flavia, Stephen here in London. This is, a moment that I think people had been preparing for, certainly in the past couple of days, as there has been, of course, this deterioration of the Queen's health. We know that she cancelled that meeting of the Privy Council yesterday as well. I'm interested in the transatlantic relationship here as well. That we've learned through snippets over the years of how much US presidents have told about their visits to Buckingham Palace and their encounters with the Queen. Always a key part of a trip to London, and one no president wanted to miss out on.
Yes, absolutely right, and that was certainly the case with Donald Trump. I think he was far more excited about coming to see the Queen than he ever was to see Theresa May, and he made it blatantly apparent. And he had lots of unpleasant things to say about the Prime Minister, but was openly gloating and gleeful to be in the presence of the Queen and to be given like the full pomp, the full treatment. And as some of us may recall, he did his own little faux pas in terms of sort of putting his hands on the Queen, which is certainly not something that anyone should do, visiting dignitary aside. I think it goes back to that special relationship, right? And it's a little bit of love and hate. On the one hand, a country that has sort of freed itself of the shackles of an English monarch, but then also kind of admires or sort of is interested in sort of some of the sort of outdated pomp and poshness of the English royal family. So I think it's fascination and disdain at the same time. But you know, it's part of that sort of rich fabric of history. And you know, I think it's sort of worth reflecting a little bit on the Queen and like how, you know, dial back to 1992, what she called her annus horribilis, where everything went absolutely wrong for her. You know, Diana, the divorce, the this and that. This is a woman who's lived through highs and lows. And, you know, I think it's quite extraordinary to sort of reflect that, you know, the country now is going to miss her so very much.
Flavia, what about closer to home and in more recent history, through Brexit, and in more recent years, as there has been upheaval in the United Kingdom? How did she try to unify the people under her government?
I mean, one extraordinary thing that the Queen did, and it was incredibly hard to do, is to do the very basic of her job, i.e. never to give an opinion, never to let on what she was thinking. In an age of social media, we're all sort of banging on and want to sort of air our views, and her one job was actually never to do so. So, you know, there was a sort of famous article written by The Sun, you know, the sort of right-wing Tory tabloid, you know, the most read paper in the country, which was speculating about, you know, the Queen was pro-Brexit. And that was like such an extraordinary moment because everyone was actually wondering, what does the Queen actually think of Brexit? Is she pro? Is she against? And the truth is, she went to her grave with that secret. No one knows. And she certainly never told. And that is quite an extraordinary thing in and of itself, because during that moment of extreme upheaval, when the country was being torn apart, you know, she was still the nominal head, but again, not, you know, ever in a position to make a decision or tip her hand one way or another.
And just reflecting on all of the different events, all of the different periods of history that she lived through, the fact that she never once revealed what her personal feelings or opinion on those matters was, is truly remarkable. And when we think about Prince Charles taking over as king, TBD on what name he will officially take, would you expect that same sort of stoicness to hold?
Very good question. Hard to know. And to be honest, hard to imagine. I mean, she is the gold standard of that. But, you know, Charles has his own views, and I think he's aired them as prince. You know, he's a very staunch environmentalist, really cares about those issues. I would be surprised if, you know, he didn't use his newfound position and heft to, in a way, kind of redefine a little bit what that role is, while still keeping, you know, a degree of distance and loftiness, but you'd expect the role to evolve. It has to, especially, I mean, you know, and it's also worth reflecting on that, you know, he's going to be quite an old king, so you'd have to go back to, you know, say the Victorian era, right? You know, when Queen Victoria died, her son, Edward VII, became king. He lasted 9 years. You know, it was a short time, and, you know, surely the age of Charles will last longer, but again, like she is really like the titan, like, you know, the overpowering force that has set the course of the monarchy. So it sort of really remains, you know, he's a sort of smaller, more diminished figure in her shadow still.
I want to go now to Stephen Carroll, who continues to join us and co-anchor with us this hour, live from London. He hosts Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Stephen, talk a little bit about the discretion. You know, we just heard from Flavia about the way that the Queen never led on to what she was thinking in terms of opinion, political opinion. Does that remind you of anything that happened with other prime ministers in the past? Share your experiences in reporting there.
Well, it's supposed to be a two-way street as well. Those prime ministers are also not supposed to share the details of their weekly meetings with the Queen, which have happened, of course, as we've been saying now, with 15 prime ministers over her reign. There was one incident where we did see that slip ever so slightly, and it was during the campaign for the Scottish independence referendum in 2014. Now, the way that this came about is that the Queen was greeting well-wishers in Scotland in the run-up to the vote, and she said to one of them that people will think very carefully about the future ahead of that vote. And it was not a, you know, people asked her this had come up because we had raised the referendum with her, and it was a casual remark she made. Of course, we know the Queen never made casual remarks, so it was something very unusual at the time. But the sentence that she said was, well, I hope people will think very carefully about the future, and that was seen as being a discreet signal from the Queen that people should vote to remain, as they did, part of the United Kingdom in that referendum. What emerged later is that David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, told the BBC in an interview that he had asked whether the Queen could, in his words, raise an eyebrow about the prospect of Scotland voting for independence, and that comment came later. And this was very much frowned upon by the palace, that he had divulged something that happened during these confidential conversations. I think the expression that was used was caused displeasure, which in royal language is extreme.
Flavia, I know you have to leave us soon, but I wanted to get one more question to you while we still have time with you. We're just now hearing from President George W. Bush saying that Laura and I were honored to have known Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She was a woman of great intellect, charm, and wit. The statement continues quite a bit, talking about spending time at Buckingham Palace and having tea with Her Majesty and her corgis. Before you go, talk to us a little bit more about the special relationship between the United States and the UK, because you spent so much time reporting on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think partly because I was on the other side of the pond, right? And it's hard to emphasize just how obsessed the British press, specifically the right wing, the Tory press, is with that special relationship. And, it's almost a fetish. And when I sort of came around here, they're like, I don't know, we guys don't spend that much time thinking about you. And it's sort of, there's an imbalance there. And I think it sort of harps back to, obviously, Winston Churchill and FDR and that kind of sense that the Brits have, that, the greatest time they had, the best was behind them. World War II was the sort of the apex of their influence, and, they were on the right side of history, and it's all been downhill since then. And then, obviously, the figure of Thatcher looms so large in the Tory party and her special relationship with Ronald Reagan. So, but then, obviously, things took a turn for the worse with Tony Blair and Bush. The country has never forgiven Blair for sort of going along with America. There were headlines about Britain being America's poodle. Even though Blair was an incredibly successful prime minister, he's absolutely loathed. And so it's something that people keep reflecting on. Like when Boris Johnson and Trump were together, like everyone's like, oh, they're so equal. But guess what? Boris Johnson was really no fan of Trump and privately absolutely hated the comparison. He's, the mop of blonde hair, the similarities were, as far as, Boris Johnson were concerned, were incredibly superficial, and he was quite embarrassed by it. So, Biden trust era doesn't quite sort of evoke the magic or the chemistry of all those sort of relationships of the past. But, who knows? They might surprise us.
Flavia, we have to let you go. We really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon and sharing your thoughts and your reporting on the passing of Queen Elizabeth. Flavia Krauss-Jackson, managing editor for Bloomberg's U.S. government coverage, joining us from our 99.1 studio in Washington, D.C. I want to right now bring in Kriti Gupta. She's Bloomberg Markets correspondent. She's with us in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Kriti, we talked about Silver Jubilee, the Platinum Jubilee, which was just a few months ago, marking 70 years on the throne. That was something that you attended. You were one of the many Americans who went to attend it. Talk to us about your experience.
I actually, this goes back to a childhood dream. I think it was 2012, I want to say, that you had the London Olympics and the Diamond Jubilee at the time kind of coincide in this big celebration. I didn't get to go then. I said, if she makes it to the Platinum, I will 100% attend, and I did. And Tim, I have to say, it was incredible to see the turnout, not just from the folks at home that you saw in the United Kingdom, but really from all around the world. This is a truly international legacy, and you're hearing that from the outpour that you're getting from, of course, the Commonwealth, from the former colonies, I might add, of the British Kingdom, as well as, of course, the United States. Even Ursula von der Leyen had come out, the president of the EU, and had come and said, at the end of the day, given all the Brexit kind of negotiations that have gone on, this kind of idea of whether or not the UK is or is not a part of Europe, she said, at the end of the day, a European leader has passed, and I think that's really sentient, I should say, and representative of just how big her role was in the broader scheme of things. I should also mention 70 years. I mean, Katie was talking about this, John Authors was talking about this earlier. A lot of Brits have not actually lived a life without having this matriarch, and this is going to be really crucial in terms of her legacy.
And Kriti, talk to us about the moment that this turnover, both in the monarchy and in the PM, is happening in terms of the British economy. We know that inflation is super, super high. We know the Bank of England has been aggressive in trying to combat it. It just feels like a very tumultuous time. Yeah, it really is. And I think one of the concerns, let's just talk logistics for a moment, and then maybe we can speak about her legacy. But logistically, one of the concerns, I believe Stephen brought this up earlier in the show as well, was simply how many people are going to now be pouring into London, pouring into the United Kingdom to pay their respect at a time when energy prices are all extremely high, at a time when you are starting to see a lot of the travel chaos continue and exceed. So the question is, in terms of logistics, how is this really going to work? And that is going to be a concern at a time when Liz Truss, by the way, only, I believe, her second day as prime minister. So she really is in the hot seat right now to say she's going to be the leader at a time when even the crown is changing.
We're still joined by Bloomberg Daybreak Europe's Stephen Carroll, who joins us live from London. Stephen, we heard Kriti just now cover some of the tumult that we're seeing, not just in the UK, but in Europe. And look, indeed, it's a story here in the United States as well. But what a week it is for the government there with a new prime minister, Liz Truss. And then also, of course, all the concerns about capping energy prices and how much Brits are going to have to pay in order to heat their homes over the next couple of winters. Contextualize all this for us in the wake of the passing of Queen Elizabeth.
I mean, this was dubbed the summer of discontent in the UK because of the waves of strike action, double-digit inflation, as we learned in July, and this huge energy price spike, which was due to take place in October, which now Liz Truss, as new Prime Minister, as her first major policy, just today unveiling the details of how she was going to limit those energy price rises for households and businesses. Just interesting to see, actually, that a lot of the unions who had strikes planned in the next few days are calling them all off now as a result of the Queen's death. But this is, it's interesting, the overlap of politics and events with the monarchy here as well, because it was actually during the announcement of that energy plan that this news that the Queen was under medical supervision came into Parliament. It was actually the Nadine Zahawi, who is essentially the head of the Cabinet Office here in the UK, who came into the chamber with a note to give to the Prime Minister, to give to the Speaker of the House, to give to the Leader of the Opposition that came via his deputy, to obviously inform them that this statement was coming from the palace a few minutes in advance. And there was some, for the reporters that were in the room, there were some questions about what were these notes being passed around Parliament, but it was the news that the Queen's condition had deteriorated, that the royal family was gathering in Balmoral and putting in chain the chain of events that we've now seen play out with the Queen dying aged 96.
We're continuing to get statements. We just heard from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada, saw that he was just speaking. And now we're getting a statement from former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who says that this is our country's saddest day. In the hearts of every one of us, there is an ache at the passing of our Queen, a deep and personal sense of loss, far more intense perhaps than we expected. His statement continues to say that she seems so timeless and so wonderful that I'm afraid we have had to come to believe, like children, that she would just go on and on. I want to bring back in Kriti Gupta and talk a little bit about the history here. 70 years. It spanned World War II.
Yeah.
Parts of World War II, I should say. The end of World War II. Well, actually 1952, so after the post-war era in the UK. But her experience during World War II was one that has been chronicled because she stayed in England during that time.
She did.
Despite the Nazi air raids.
During the Blitz. I mean, look, when the onset of World War II, 1939, she was 13 years old at the time, and basically throughout the war, she actually spent her time, I want to say, at Windsor and Balmoral, so she was close to London, but not in the heart of it, alongside her sister, Princess Margaret, at the time. I think what's really striking, and it speaks to her character and this idea that duty comes first, that country comes first, that when she was 19 years old, she trained for the British Army. She trained as a driver, she trained as a mechanic, she also trained as a nurse. nurse alongside Princess Margaret. So I think that really speaks to that. And then ascended the throne when she was 25 years old, to your point, Tim, in 1952, told on her honeymoon, by the way, that she was in Kenya by Prince Philip. So it really is a significant turnaround at the sudden passing of her father, King George VI. I think what's interesting, what you have to note about Queen Elizabeth is that she really was quite modern, and in terms of how she had to really adapt to the changing times. For example, something that is really important is the fact that she actually allowed media access into the private lives of the royals. This was at the time in the 50s and the 60s was not something the BBC or even any other media outlets were really granted access to. So the fact that she actually televised some of the royal family's life, televised what the inside of Buckingham Palace looked like in 1970 was quite significant. Also, even bringing tours into Buckingham Palace, saying that those palaces are the people's. They should have access to them was pretty significant. She also condoned the dissolution of her sister's marriage in 1978, which, think about it, at the time, the concept of divorce or dissolution of marriage was quite scandalous, only to have, of course, the more popular Annus Horribilis in the 1992, I want to say.
Yeah, that's correct. That's
the
the year.
divorce there. Yeah. And we should also keep in mind, her first prime minister, Winston Churchill. So a historic life, 16 prime ministers to follow, and really just incredible in terms of everything she's accomplished.
A historic life, and there's so many key events that happened during the 70 years that Queen Elizabeth was on the throne. One of the more notable happenings, though, is the renewed tension that we saw in Northern Ireland and renewed tension in Anglo-Irish relations, Stephen. And as we push forward and as we await Prince Charles to become King Charles, rather,
perhaps,
if that's his name, if
right.
that's ultimately what he decides, what do you expect on that front?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. He is the king. It is just this question over the name that we're waiting for confirmation on. But at a time when the future of the union is more in question now than it has been for a long time, we had, in 2014, Scotland voted to stay part of the union, but the Brexit referendum has again put a lot of strain on that relations, and we know that the Scottish National Party, who are the majority in Scotland, are looking for another referendum that has to be granted by the government in London. And then, obviously, the situation in Northern Ireland, much further complicated by Brexit. There is now much more impetus for a drive towards holding a referendum there on a united Ireland, not something that's going to be imminent, but certainly the dial moved with the Brexit referendum. And the Queen was seen as one of the unifying forces of the Union, and whether or not that can be passed over and transmitted in the same way under King, the new King, that is something that is going to be a huge challenge and something that will change the fabric of how this country operates. I do want to bring in the Queen's, again, talking about her soft diplomatic power, travelling as head of state. A visit that always stands out to me as an Irish person was her visit to Ireland in 2011, which was the first by a reigning monarch. And it was something, she took part in events which nobody had expected that she would take part. She laid a wreath in the Garden of Remembrance, which commemorates people who died fighting for Irish independence from the United Kingdom. And she also stood up at a state dinner in Dublin Castle and started her address with a few words of Irish. She said, "President and friends, Uachtaráin agus a Cóide," in Irish, which in terms of Anglo-Irish relations, given that there was 30 years of fighting in Northern Ireland in which thousands of people died, ending in a peace agreement in 1998, the fractious relations that have existed since Ireland's independence between Dublin and London, that was a momentous moment in Anglo-Irish relations, seen and something that's being recognised by the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, speaking today as well after the death of the Queen too. So just a very small picture of the sort of influence the Queen had in her role.
A small picture, but Stephen, a very, very big moment. We're continuing to hear from heads of state around the world. This time, President Biden weighing in. We heard from the White House already. The president weighing in with a long statement. I'll read part of it. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II was more than a monarch. She defined an era. In a world of constant change, she was a steadying presence and a source of comfort and pride for generations of Britons, including many who have never known their country without her. An enduring admiration for Queen Elizabeth II united people across the Commonwealth. The 7 decades of her history-making reign bore witness to an age of unprecedented human advancement and the forward march of human dignity. The statement continues, though. In the meantime, I do want to bring in Kitty Donaldson, a Bloomberg News UK political editor who joins us on the phone from London. Kitty, good to have you with us. I want to talk a little bit about the political landscape moving forward here. We did hear from new Prime Minister Liz Truss, but politically, how does somebody who served the people for 70 years and had such a big influence, not just in the UK, but around the world, those are very big shoes to fill.
Well, absolutely, and we are absolutely devastated over here. It's been a very, very strange day. So since we got the rumours started at lunchtime in the UK, when the notes started being passed around the House of Commons, and I was in the House of Commons at the time, working at my desk upstairs, and I saw these notes being passed between MPs, and I dashed downstairs because it's odd, that stuff sort of never really happens, and grabbed an MP as he was coming out of the House of Commons chamber and said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Oh, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition being updated on the Queen's health." And I said, "What? Oh my God, is it as bad as we think?" And they said, "No, it's not as bad as we think, but it's very, very serious." And since then, people have been gathering in knots around Parliament and quiet kind of corners, and just a very strange atmosphere because the Queen was sort of everything to people in the UK, and I just remember, as you know, I'm in my 40s now, but I've never known a time without her. And I think something like 85% of the population in the UK has never known a time without the Queen as head of state. And I grew up in the 80s, and there was a woman on the woman on the throne, and Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. And actually, as a little girl, it was a wonderful time to grow up because you saw these two role models and thought, actually, as a woman, you can do something. And so going forward, absolutely, King Charles, as he is now, we've just had confirmation from his office that he will be known as King Charles III. That's just come through in the last couple of minutes. He will have incredibly big shoes to fill. She was an absolutely wonderful woman, and she almost never put a foot wrong. She was never controversial. She never gave an opinion when she shouldn't have. And he, of course, Charles, has given opinions, so that'd be quite interesting whether he carries on doing that. It's not clear yet whether he will take a more constitutional role. The monarch is supposed to sit above politics and not get involved. So he's been accused of meddling in the past, and whether he will do that going forward is not yet clear. I suspect not, because he has a very defined constitutional role from going onwards. But I sound, you can probably hear in my voice, I sound quite shocked,
Yeah.
Because just a few days ago, the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, flew up to Aberdeenshire, which is where Balmoral is, the kind of the big sort of Scottish castle up in the Highlands in Scotland, and we had a picture, and even though the Queen is 96 and she had a fire going, although it was raining that day, so she had a roaring wood fire going, she was on her feet, she shook Liz Truss's hand, and there was a photo released. And so sort of, everyone was like, well, I mean, I personally didn't think anything more of it. I was, she's done her thing. And then so to have the kind of decline so quickly in the last few days is actually quite a shock to the system, to be honest.
And Kitty, it's an extraordinary time to be a journalist. It's an extraordinary time to be a UK political editor, which is what you are. What do the next few days look like for you in terms of your coverage and Bloomberg's coverage?
Well, already, she was 96, so it's not like we haven't been expecting it. You're about to see on The Wire and online our obituary, which spans her reign, and also I've written a piece which it spells out what happens in the next few days. So in planning terms, today is known as day zero. And that means everything starts from here, basically. We've had a statement from the Prime Minister, from Liz Truss, we're basically working down to day 10. Day 10 is a public holiday in the UK, and it's when the state funeral happens. In between now and then, her body needs to come back to London. It will lie in state in Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall is the old part of the Palace of Westminster. It's the kind of ancient part. And you probably remember the Queen Mother lying in state there. And people troop past to pay their respects, and that will happen for a few days. The new king, King Charles III, he will do a tour of the nations and regions of the UK, basically introducing himself to his subjects. But first of all, tomorrow morning, there's a thing called the Accession Council, and that dates back to King Alfred the Great, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And it's basically all the kind of advisors to the monarch. They stand round and say, yes, you are king. You know, we affirm you as king. And that happens at St James's Palace, which is quite a small, sort of delicate palace in the centre of London. And the Privy Council go in. They've actually had to limit the number of people going in because during the Queen's reign, I think she's appointed something like 800 members of the Privy Council. The Privy Council is supposed to be kind of the people closest to the monarch. Yeah. But because she was around for so long, they've got tons and tons of these people just waiting to kind of, be advisor to the Queen or the monarch. And so they've had to limit the number of people who are going in tomorrow. There's been a ballot, which caused quite a lot of ruffled feathers, I was told, because, of course, everybody wants to be, in the grand ceremony, but they can't all fit in the room. So tomorrow morning they'll have the Accession Council, and they proclaim him, King Charles as king. And that's a kind of formal, very ancient ceremony. And then they come out onto the balcony of St James's Palace, and a bunch of they call buglers. Is that the right word? Yeah. Bugles anyway. I've never used that word before in my life. So but people with bugles anyway.
It works for us.
Proclaim him. Yeah, good. I'm glad. We'll proclaim him king, standing there, and after that he goes to Buckingham Palace, which becomes his official residence, which is the official residence of the monarch in London. And then, of course, we've got all the question of state funeral and all the kind of business around that to conclude.
I just want to remind everybody right now, this is our special coverage of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. We're joined right now by Kitty Donaldson, Bloomberg News UK political editor, who joins us on the phone from London. Also joining us from London is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe's Stephen Carroll, joining us live from there as well. I'm Tim Stenevec, along with Katie Greifeld in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're here with Kriti Gupta as well, Bloomberg Markets correspondent. I know that anybody who's been to the UK can relate to this, because on my first trip there years ago when I was a kid, one memory that I have is of these bright red mailboxes all over the city. And this was years ago, so I don't even know if they're all over the city anymore. But each mailbox, sturdy metal things with the Queen's initials on them. There was a sense of permanence to her. And I wonder, Kriti, what you know about what happens to things like that. Her name, her image, everywhere. Here in the United States, when there's a new president, you get a new portrait of a new president at federal office.
Right.
But this is so different.
A lot of logistical things happening, and it almost feels silly to bring it up to really put into perspective for such a prominent woman. But let's just talk about where you might see those changes. Perhaps not immediately, but in the next couple of months, arguably the next couple of years, just given some of the issues the UK is going through logistically. But your currency, for example, British pounds, British coins. You have a 50 pence. Every single piece of currency has Queen Elizabeth's face on it at the moment. Ultimately, that will transition as it does with every monarch. Of course, it will take some time, and there will be questions about, what kind of image Charles wants to give, just given that he is the new king. The royal mailboxes that you specifically brought up, sturdy indeed. They are all red. They are engraved with the ER sign. Elizabeth Regina is what that stands for. So there's questions about whether that'll change to a CR, a Charles Regina, in terms of the symbolism there. The passport's the same symbol. The national anthem, God Save the Queen, that will change to God Save the King ultimately. Something else to really keep in mind here is also just, it's kind of mind-boggling right now to really think about everything that will change. But I actually wanted to ask Stephen a question, if I may here, because
Please.
I'm very curious. I mean, Stephen, I've grown up becoming such an Anglophile and so fascinated with the British royal family. One of the really key pieces of, I want to say, transitions in terms of thinking of the royal family has been how Queen Elizabeth specifically approaches the aristocracy. I mean, the fact that Princess Diana was part of the aristocracy, but then, of course, that ended tragically. You had Kate Middleton, who was not a member of nobility at all, and even that came with its challenges, to mention even Meghan Markle. I'm curious about the reception that Prince Charles, or now King Charles III, will get, given the history and given the contentiousness of his history with even Camilla and even his own decisions. What kind of response can we expect from the public?
Well, I think the thing is that the response doesn't happen yet, because the public will have to get used to. You were just talking about some of those fundamental changes that had to happen here, and people will have to get used to the idea of there being King Charles III and what that means for his style of reigning. The constitutional role is very limited, and you can be very sure that the Queen will have instructed Charles over the years as to how you conduct yourself as a monarch, and how the monarchy should fulfill its role in British society. But it will be, we really don't know, because until now he has, of course, been the heir to the throne and been more free to speak, and we heard that said earlier in the programme as well, that he has spoken out of turn on occasion and ruffled a few feathers, and he will now be in a very different position, and it will be a case of the public having to get used to the style that comes with him being on the money, and all of those symbols that you talked about having to change as well. So it's a really big adjustment. And again, that point that Kitty made, 70 years on the throne, which means the majority of the people in this country have never known anything other than Queen Elizabeth. And the challenge that awaits Charles is not only the ceremonial and the soft power and the weekly meetings with the Prime Minister and the official functions, but creating the same myth, the same aura that the Queen had as a uniting force. I mean, just think about the transformation of the monarchy from in the time that Queen Elizabeth was monarch. You know, you couldn't have envisaged, neither technologically nor culturally, that she would participate in a video with Paddington, as she did for her Platinum Jubilee, which was or that she would have participated in a video where she was seen diving out of a plane at the start of the London 2012 Olympics. The monarchy has had to evolve. This is another evolution of it, but it is a huge change for people to get used to.
You know, Stephen, it also reminds me, I forgot to even mention this, the Elizabeth line was just introduced in London, I want to say a couple of months ago as well. I think I will never forget the image of Queen Elizabeth II in a purple suit. It was like a purple skirt and combo that matched the exact color of the new Elizabeth line. And I think it was just such a lovely tribute to her.
Yes, and that is, again, part of her legacy and something that will live on, this new piece of infrastructure in London. And it was wonderful to see her attending the opening of that line. And, you know, the fashion choices, I think, are something I think we will be seeing a lot in papers over the coming days here in the UK. You know, she was known for her style, and I think that there will be a lot of people who will be looking to revisit some of her outfits from over the years as well. And clearly, again, in that sense of appropriateness and that sense of suiting every occasion, which she was so expert at. And that is something that now becomes, that challenge now falls to King Charles.
And Stephen, you brought up the Queen's soft power, and a lot of that is diplomacy with other nations. We know that the US-UK relationship has changed a lot over the past 70 years. As we push ahead and anticipate what King Charles's reign might look like, how do you anticipate President Biden and King Charles will communicate with each other? When do you think that first phone call might take place?
It's very difficult to say at this stage, because the royal family is now officially in mourning, and I would see it as being unlikely. Of course, we don't have lived experience of this, so it's not, we can't draw on what happened the last time around, because 70 years ago it was a very different situation. We should expect very little in terms of official communications for the moment, apart from statements being made. Kitty Donaldson may have a clearer view on this, but the expectation is that this will be a quiet period, except for the national address that we would be expecting from the King in the coming days leading up to the funeral. This is an official period of mourning, and business of government certainly being suspended in that period.
Well, how long is that business of government suspended? You know, when we talk about the royal family, Stephen, we talk a lot about the economic impact. I mean, look at Creedy, you know, as an example of this, right? An Anglophile who
Your classic American tourist
truly,
who
though,
goes to London at any chance she gets. Yeah,
exactly. But there's a serious economic impact here, and it's also been one of the arguments about continuing to support the monarchy through taxes. And
yes, and it is something.
Go ahead.
It's an argument that
it's about continuing to support the monarchy through taxes. And
yes, and it is something.
Go ahead.
It's an argument that happens, you know, reasonably regularly here. Is what the value of the monarchy is, and the added value because there's, you know, even people like Critty who are coming to London for it, there is a value in that to the UK as well, but one that's very difficult to put a figure on. They are also, you know, the Crown Estate is one of the biggest landlords here in London in terms of their wealth that exists too. But it's true, there is that taxpayer subsidy, and that is something that could, and very unlikely in the short term, but is something that could down the line be a subject of debate again. It is periodically in the history of the monarchy that there have been debates over how much the royal family should get in money from the government. There are many experts that argue they're excellent value for the country because of how much you know I suppose they do in terms of secondary economic benefits. It's something that we shouldn't expect any debate about that in the short time. There won't be. There are plenty of people in this country who are, you know, let's say Republicans in a sense, abstract from how you use it in the United States,
of course,
who will be keeping quiet, one would hope, during this period, as this is now the time that we reflect on the Queen's legacy rather than necessarily those big questions about the monarchy. That's not to say they won't be asked down the line.
Right. Okay. That's really helpful. Thank you. Stephen, I want to continue with you. We're talking right now to Stephen Carroll of Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, who joins us live from London for our special coverage of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. What about when it comes to other business in the United Kingdom? And this is a program